quorum, I declare this meeting in session. Welcome to this meeting of the Standing Senate Committee on National Security, Defence and Veterans Affairs. I'm Tony Dean, the Chair of the Committee representing Ontario. I'm joined today by my fellow committee members who I will now welcome to introduce themselves, beginning with our Deputy Chair.
Bonjour, alors Jean-Guy Dagenet, sénateur du Québec.
Dave Richard, Senator from New Brunswick.
Hello, welcome. Marty Deacon, Ontario.
How about me, Marty? Can I introduce myself too?
I didn't see you, so
You didn't see me. I know, I'm small. I'm Don Pletton. I'm from Landmark, Manitoba, a very small village, but I didn't think I was that small.
my apologies. Nice to see you, Marty Deacon, Ontario.
Andrew Cardozo from Ontario.
Donna Dasco, Senator from Ontario.
Hassan Youssef, Senator from Ontario.
Peter Beam, Ontario.
Thank you very much, colleagues. On my left is the committee's clerk, Ms. Erica Dupont. For those watching the session, we're continuing today our study on Bill C21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments, all in relation to the regulation of firearms in Canada. Today we will hear from three panels of witnesses representing law enforcement organisations. In our first panel, we have the pleasure of welcoming by video conference, on behalf of the Canadian Association of Police Chiefs, Deputy Chief Bill Fordy, co-chair of the Special Purpose Committee on Firearms, and on behalf of the First Nations Chiefs of Police Association, Edward Lennard Busch, Executive Director. We thank you for joining us today, and we invite you to provide your opening remarks, which will be followed by questions from our members. I remind you that you each have 5 minutes for your testimony. We begin today with Deputy Chief Bill Fordy, and Deputy Chief, please proceed whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to address this committee on behalf of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police. The CAC supports Bill C21 in principle and believes this law is introducing essential provisions to the Criminal Code and Firearms Act. First, we support the new provisions aimed at addressing privately made firearms, also known as ghost guns. That is why the CACP is strongly in favor of, first, the expansion of the definition of prohibited firearm to include any unlawfully manufactured firearm, regardless of the means or method of manufacture. Number two, the addition of the definition of firearm part to Section 84.1 of the Criminal Code, and the addition of this terminology to other provisions in the code pertaining to prohibition orders, offenses, and exemptions. Three, the creation of an offense for possessing or distributing computer data that would allow the illegal manufacturing of ghost guns. Four, the creation of an offense for altering a cartridge magazine from one that is not prohibited to one that is. And five, the new requirement to hold a firearms license to acquire a cartridge magazine. With respect to the issue of replica firearms, the CACP agreed with the prohibition originally introduced to the bill related to replica firearms, specifically those that are a likeness to real firearms and are indistinguishable from a genuine article from near or far. They can be altered to convert them into deadly weapons. We welcome additional language in the bill related to likeness and discharge, including muzzle velocity and muzzle energy. However, imitation firearms remain largely unregulated, and users can acquire them easily without proof of age, license, or competency. Third, the issue of smuggling and trafficking. The CACP continues to maintain that restricting lawful firearms ownership will not meaningfully address the issue of illegal firearms obtained from the United States. That is why we support all legislative amendments focused on addressing border integrity, smuggling, and trafficking priorities. Of significant concern is the absence of data to help understand the pathways crime guns take before they are seized as part of a criminal investigation in Canada. In 2022, the CACP passed a resolution calling for the mandatory tracing of all crime guns in Canada. At the moment, while the National Police Service, the RCMP, have introduced a policy that all crime guns must be traced, only the province of Ontario has made it mandatory. Firearms tracing creates a chain of custody from the manufacturer to the licensed dealer to the purchaser. It can enhance our ability to identify trends and patterns, to identify and stop the sources of illegal firearms used to commit crimes in Canada, and to reduce gun violence in our country. In the absence of legislation to mandate that police agencies across Canada trace firearms in a consistent and regular manner, we will continue to struggle in this domain. Fifth, the CACP also supports the new regime of emergency prohibition orders, also known as the red flag law, and the requirement to surrender firearms and relevant documents such as firearms licenses to help reduce gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, and self-harm by limiting access to firearms by those who pose a risk of harm to themselves or to others. The CACP supports the addition of Clause 16 in the Firearm Act, indicating that an individual is not eligible to hold a firearms license if they are or were subject of a protection order, and that their license can be revoked if they have been convicted of an offense that involved the use, threat, or attempted violence against their intimate partner or any member of their family. Sixth, on matters relating to bail reform, the CACP is concerned with how repeat violent offenders and those charged with offenses involving firearms are being managed by our justice system. Many individuals who pose a significant threat to public and officer safety are being released back into the community without the appropriate care or restrictions required while they await trial. We ask the committee to consider adding the following legislative amendments to the criminal code. Number one, require that bail hearings for the most serious firearms offenses be heard by a judge of a superior court of criminal jurisdiction or a judge as defined in Section 552 of the Criminal Code, or a provincial court judge, and that alleged breaches of a judicial release order be heard by a judge of the same level of court that granted the initial release. Second, provide sentencing judges with the discretionary ability to increase parole ineligibility to 2/3 of a custodial sentence when the court finds that an offender has discharged a firearm in a congregate setting in committing the offense, and that this discretionary ability on sentencing be extended to those who are found to be parties to such offenses. And number three, create an additional route to automatic consideration of first-degree murder under Section 231, sub 4 of the Criminal Code by including a death that results from the discharge of a firearm in a congregate setting. In conclusion, and with respect, it is important for our citizens to remember that in Canada, ownership of a firearm is not a right, it is a privilege. Legislation must strike an appropriate balance between the rights of the accused and those of victims, survivors, communities, police officers, and public safety to help mitigate the impact of the worst outcomes of firearms. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Fordy. Colleagues, we have a third witness who was delayed earlier and can join us now, so I'm going to suspend briefly, and we will welcome on behalf of the Association des directeurs de police du Québec, Mr. Didier Deramond, the Director General. So we will suspend briefly. We will continue now with a second witness as we continue our study of Bill C21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments with respect to firearms. Our second witness today appears on behalf of the Association des directeurs de police du Québec, and we welcome the Director General, Mr. Didier Deramond. Mr. Deramond, please proceed whenever you are ready. You have 5 minutes for your testimony.
Alors, merci.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Members of the committee, the Association des directeurs du Québec would like to thank you for giving us the opportunity to comment on Bill C21. First, may I remind you that our association represents all the chiefs of police, would like, in the context of the rise in gun violence in Quebec and the historic use of guns for mass killings, would like to underscore a number of concerns we have about the new iteration of Bill C21. Before going further, our association would like to clarify that support for the changes brought to the legislation to do with ghost guns and the regulations regarding high-capacity cartridges and the creation of advisory committees comprised of experts to independently study the classification of weapons that are currently on the Canadian market. Those are all our concerns. Having said that, even though a number of changes were made since we last appeared before your committee, our association believes that new provisions must be included in the current bill to ensure that it has the desired effects. Let me explain myself. Currently, anyone with a possession and acquisition permit can buy the ammunition that they want, but in any quantity, even though it might be a worrisome quantity. In other words, an individual can buy ammunition caliber for weapons that they don't even possess and in whatever quantity they want, and that does not constitute an offence. You'll agree that this is a major issue given the increase in illegal firearms and the homemade 3D and ghost gun weapons across Quebec. Our association strongly believes that there needs to be a correlation between the firearm and the ammunition that is possessed, and that any purchase of ammunition must also be regulated. And when it comes to parts that don't have a serial number, they should also be prohibited because anyone can purchase them. Our association believes that it is crucial to regulate firearms parts, and that is why we also believe that the government should force those manufacturers to put serial numbers across all firearms parts in order to facilitate traceability. Dear Senators, were the bill amended with these 4 new provisions? 1, a correlation between the arms permit and ammunitions, a registry for ammunitions, no sale of parts without permit, and force manufacturers to put serial numbers on parts. This bill, in our opinion, would be better tailored to the state of affairs and have a greater impact. Now, may I also tell you about a number of concerns that we have, as our President did in his last appearance before you. It is important to remind you that some of the provisions of the legislation must be dovetailed with Quebec legislation. In Quebec, we have an act to protect individuals from gun violence. This legislation makes it almost impossible to have the 30-day time limit for the revocation of a firearms license that exists in the federal sphere. And unfortunately, this is an issue of a lack of correspondence between the federal and provincial legislation. So we would request that this 30-day revocation period be increased such that federal and provincial legislation would be more harmonious and in harmony. A poll which was conducted by the Criminal Intelligence Service of Quebec reveals that 65% of police officers say that they have limited knowledge about the Firearms Act itself. 85% of these police officers believe that they should be better trained when it comes to firearms. And these percentages, let's admit, are very high and demonstrate that the training of police officers when it comes to the Firearms Act must be enhanced. That's why our association is recommending a strong investment in the training of police officers when the legislation is amended. Now, the association would like to remind senators of the need to increase funding in other areas, firearms officers and other such matters. In closing, even though we welcome this legislation, we would like to remind you that Bill C5 removes minimum mandatory sentences in the case of some offences, and that seems to fly in the face of the current legislation. This should be more consistent in order to ensure our safer communities. Unlike other countries, the possession of a weapon should remain a privilege and not a right. This message of coherence must also be transmitted to our youth. Our young adults are the ones that use and trivialise the use of firearms far too often. Our association acknowledges the noble intentions of this bill, and we provide our support with one caveat, and that is the federal government should amend the legislation by including the correlation between the permit for a firearm and the ammunition. And there should also be a prohibition of firearms parts without serial numbers. And as I said, manufacturers must put serial numbers on firearms for traceability purposes. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deramond. Colleagues, our third witness on this panel is Mr. Edward Leonard Busch, Executive Director representing the First Nations Chiefs of Police Associations. Please proceed whenever you're ready, Mr. Busch. You need to take yourself off mute, Mr. Busch.
Thank you. On behalf of the First Nations Chiefs of Police Association, I extend our sincere gratitude to the committee for inviting us to present our perspectives on Bill C21. It is an honor and privilege to have this opportunity to share our insights and to contribute to the conversation surrounding this critical legislation. The First Nations Chiefs Police Association is an association representing self-administered Indigenous law enforcement across Canada. We were founded in 1993 and were established with the fundamental goal of advocating for and advancing the interest, rights, and safety of Indigenous communities through effective policing strategies. Our membership is comprised of chiefs of police and leaders from the various First Nations communities and policing partners. The FNC serves a platform for collaboration, knowledge sharing, and the development of culturally sensitive law enforcement practices. These practices are tailored to the unique needs and traditions of Indigenous peoples, recognizing their distinct cultural heritage and in promoting community-centered policing methodologies. We work hard to foster partnerships between Indigenous communities, government agencies, law enforcement bodies at local, provincial, and federal levels. Through these alliances, the FNCP aims to address the complex challenges faced by Indigenous populations, including issues related to crime prevention, public safety, and the preservation of cultural values within the law enforcement practices. We are currently engaged with Public Safety Canada in providing insight and advice on proposed essential service legislation. As a recognized and respected voice within Canadian law enforcement landscape, we play a pivotal role in enhancing dialogue, fostering understanding, and promoting effective strategies, prioritizing the well-being and security of Indigenous communities across Canada. While an absolute consensus on this issue is unattainable, as Indigenous policing across Canada is as diverse as the many communities that self-administered Indigenous police services serve. We differ in geographical locations, size, capacity, cultural beliefs, and local governance structures. In terms of capacity, the FNCPA recognizes and supports Indigenous communities that are capable and even adamant about their ability and inherent right to self-regulate and administer Native law as it pertains to the use of firearms in their communities. Some Indigenous communities have comprehensive strategies that work well and hope that these rights for them to do so are recognized and reflected in the legislation. That said, there are aspects of the proposed legislation that would enjoy broad support from many of our police services and reflect the serious concerns in our communities about gun violence. We recognize that Bill C21 reflects acknowledgments by the government that addressing gun violence necessitates a multifaceted approach encompassing education, prevention, and law enforcement. We recognize the importance of this comprehensive strategy to tackle the root causes of violence while addressing criminal elements that are doing harm in our communities. The FNCPA generally aligns with the proposed natural approach outlined in Bill C21 rather than a fragmented municipality or community-based strategy when managing handgun issues. We advocate for measures aimed at reducing access to firearms to criminals while respecting the rights of law-abiding Indigenous individuals to engage in traditional sports and activities. Honorable members of the Standing Senate Committee, the First Nations Chief Police Association emphasized that while Bill C21 constitutes a critical component in enhancing the safety of Indigenous communities in Canada, its efficacy hinges on other complementary reforms. We underscore the necessity of coupling this legislation with substantive bail and sentencing reforms, along with comprehensive measures targeting the multifaceted facets of violence within communities. As such, the FNCP acknowledges the importance of Bill C21. It stresses the importance of a multifaceted approach encompassing multiple strategies to effectively address the underlying cause of violence and ensure a safer future for Indigenous communities across the nation. It is essential to emphasize that restricting lawful handgun ownership alone will not effectively address the core issue, which is the influx of illegal handguns from the United States, fueling a troubling surge in gun-related violence in our communities and across the country. This surge for us is predominantly linked to gangs, street factions, and highly organized criminal entities. In many cases, particularly in rural areas, Indigenous police sources encounter otherwise legal long guns that have been modified to render them prohibited. Safe storage is also an issue in many Indigenous communities, where police officers often encounter firearms in vehicles or residences where no accommodation has been made for trigger locks or secure gun cabinets. Therefore, our support extends to implementing new firearms-related offenses, reinforced border controls, and augmented penalties to dissuade criminal activities, to combat firearms smuggling and trafficking, and to mitigate the infiltration of illicit firearms into our communities. The FNCBA strongly advocates for initiatives targeting the criminal use and diversion of firearms into the illegal market as well. Additionally, we endorse the red flag law aimed at reducing gender-based and intimate partner violence, as well as self-harm by limiting firearms access to individuals to posing harm risk. Such initiatives is aligned with our dedication to ensuring community safety and well-being. It is unfortunate that in some areas in Canada, the provisions and tools afforded to police under the Matrimonial Real Property Act, such as emergency protection orders, have not yet been implemented. We've been told time again that this is due to the fact that judges and Crown prosecutors have not yet been trained under that legislation and won't prosecute offenses under that legislation. Furthermore, we welcome changes granting law enforcement enhanced access to information about license holders involved in suspected criminal activities. In conclusion, the FNCB supports enhancing safety for the public and frontline officers. While endorsing the principles of Bill C21, we emphasize the necessity of clear guidelines delineating the roles and responsibilities of police services in enforcing these regulations. Balancing the needs of responsible firearm owners with protective measures is crucial in mitigating the adverse effects of firearms within our communities. As champions of Indigenous rights and traditions, the FNCB remains committed to collaborating with government entities to ensure that measures aimed at firearms regulation align with the diverse needs and values of Indigenous communities across Canada. We thank the Senate Committee for letting us share our views on Bill C21. We're grateful for your attention to our thoughts on Indigenous rights, community safety, and how this law affects our diverse groups. Thank you for valuing our perspective.
Thank you very much, Mr. Busch. We'll now proceed to questions. Our guests, colleagues are here until around 4:05 p.m. and we'll do our very best to provide each member with the opportunity to ask a question. We have 4 minutes for each question, including the answer. You're familiar with the 30-second warning sign. I ask you to keep your questions succinct and identify the witness that you are addressing your question to. The first question goes to our Deputy Chair, Senator Dagenet.
Merci, Monsieur.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. My first questions will be directed at Mr. Deramond. Mr. Deramond, do you find that C21 meets the concerns of police that have to fight criminals who are increasingly young and using guns to establish their territory? Do you believe that the problem of armed youth is more the legislative responsibility than a judicial one? And do you believe that sentences are not sufficiently deterrents? Well, thank you very much for the question, Senator Dagenet. Yes, you are right, and that is sort of what I was alluding to in my opening statement, i.e. the lack of coherency. Now, C21 is supposed to be tougher, and some aspects of the legislation are tougher, and that's good to clamp down on crime. But does it really address the problems that we have in Quebec? Not really. It is a good start. One can't be against motherhood and apple pie, i.e. the safety of our communities, and that was far from our intention. But we need to get through a clear message about youth that are seduced by criminal gangs and use these weapons when they engage in crime across our communities. So there's been a trivialization of weapons and guns on the part of our youth. So we need to get a message through to them by way of this legislation so that they no longer trivialize gun use. Question. You just suggested a number of amendments in your opening remarks. Were they proposed when in the House of Commons committee study? And why is it that your message wasn't heard in that case? Well, some of our proposals were put forward to the House of Commons Committee. There was C5 recommendations, but C5 was enacted. There are a number of our recommendations that were not retained, however. Now, I can't tell you why a number of our proposals were not factored in or retained, but there's been a number of iterations of this legislation when it comes to the red flag laws and gun parts, and that, of course, wasn't in the first iteration, and that's why we're coming back with a slew of new proposals. Do I have any time, Mr. Chairperson, for more questions? My next question will be for Mr. Busch. C21 does comprise the protection of women against domestic and conjugal violence across the board and among Indigenous persons. It guarantees ancestral rights of First Nations when it comes to firearms, and the representatives from the communities that we've heard have said that they are able to deal with family-based. It's difficult for them to deal with conjugal violence when weapons are concerned. What do you think about that?
I think it's, I'm glad that that's in the legislation. I know that similar legislation in the Matrimonial and Real Property Act regarding, protection orders that police can use. They've been used in Quebec and Ontario predominantly, but some of the other provinces have been very, very slow to give police those powers. So enshrining those types of powers, reinforcing those types of powers within this legislation, I think would be a good and useful thing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I have Senators Platt, Senator Deakin, Ontario, Richards, Cardozo and Beam. Senator Platt, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is for Mr. Fordy. Mr. Fordy, one of the tasks of the committee that you are part of is to examine the current firearm situation from a legislative standpoint with a goal to assess the effectiveness of existing legislation and identify areas of enhancement or change. When it comes to C21, the bill will do nothing on the issues of firearms struggling or about the criminal use of firearms. In fact, other legislation that the government has enacted, notably C5, is actually reducing penalties for certain firearms-related crime. The main thing that the bill is doing is preventing the future purchase and sale of legal handguns, which will not actually take any of those firearms out of circulation, at least not quickly. But it is successfully upsetting legal gun owners and enhancing division on this issue in Canada. My question, Mr. Fordy, is if you look at Bill C21 as a whole, and in keeping with your mandate to assess the effectiveness of this bill, where would you rate this bill on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of effectiveness?
You're on mute, Mr. Fordy.
Sorry, I just unmuted myself. Thank you for your question. I think with respect to knowing the long-term impact of the bill, it's difficult. I would acknowledge that the bill does not address, root causes of crime, the root causes of why people engage in the criminal lifestyle and ultimately have firearms during in their possession. It does not address the root causes of domestic violence. But my hope is that we would see over time the ability to come to possess firearms diminished. It become less lucrative and less productive in terms of their ability to generate money for their criminal enterprise.
Again, for the criminal enterprise, and of course nobody's arguing that the criminal enterprise shouldn't be having these guns. We're talking about legal gun owners. Do you believe this bill is effective? My follow-up to that, and I really would like you to be a little more clear on the effectiveness that this will have on doing exactly what you're doing. Nobody's arguing that we should clamp down on gun smuggling, which doesn't seem to be. We have every police telling us that's one of the biggest problems, but it doesn't address that. So the effectiveness of this bill as a whole on legal gun owners, but my next question is for each one of the witnesses. The minister has been in our committee here and told us that the government has consulted widely, implying that almost every association, every organization had been consulted. Very briefly, Mr. Cordy and the other witnesses, or Mr. Fordy, I apologize, and the other witnesses, were your police organizations and associations consulted before this iteration of the bill, not a previous iteration of it, but this one? Were you consulted on it?
My last personal consultation was with Minister Mendocino. So not this minister, the previous minister, to answer your questions specifically.
No, well, that's fine. I appreciate that, but it was on this bill. He did consult you on this bill.
Well, I don't remember the exact date that I met with the minister, and I thought your question was, did I consult with this minister, not the previous one? I did not consult with this
apologize if
minister.
I wasn't clear. No, my question really is with the government, whether it's this minister or another minister or a committee. But to the other two witnesses as well, were your police associations consulted? Mr. Busch first, if Go ahead, sir.
We had, thank you. We had some conversation with the previous minister, Mr. Mendocino, as well. It wasn't, I wouldn't describe it as a deep consultation. It was more or less that we were informed this was an issue coming up and that the government would like the support of the First Nations Police Association, Chiefs of Police Association on it, but there wasn't a lot of information at that time. And since then, I'm unaware of us being consulted as an association. I can't say that individual chiefs of police haven't had more communication with government on it.
Thank you. And how about the Quebec Police Association, sir? Were you consulted?
Oui, alors c'est la même.
Well, the same on our side. We did have a discussion with the minister and the minister's office, but it was more of a presentation than a consultation, to my mind.
Okay, thank you. Senator Deakin, Ontario.
That is what this government does well. They tell you something and then they say they consulted.
Senator Deakin, Ontario.
Thank you. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. We have waited, and we've waited a long time to chance to listen to you today, so appreciate that. My first question concerns the issue of ghost guns, particularly those that can be downloaded and printed. And we had a chance recently to see how this is done, and it's quite overwhelming. Clause 1.4 adds section 102.1 to the code, which criminalizes the possession and accessing of computer data that would allow the illegal manufacturing of these ghost guns with 3D printers as an example, or the distribution or publishing of data due to or for the manufacture of ghost guns. I'm wondering how you see this being enforced. Do you have the capacity to conduct investigations on this newer cyber crime? I'll start first with Deputy Chief Bill Fordy. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you for your question through the chair. I can confirm for you that the privately made firearms or ghost guns is probably the single biggest issue that we're discussing with our colleagues in Canada and also with the United States as we're seeing it's becoming more and more prevalent in the United States. In terms of our capacity to investigate, like any emerging trend or emerging issue, we will develop scale. We are not yet completely aware of the challenges we face. We are in dialogue. You're seeing investigations take place that involve the Ontario Provincial Police, our colleagues in Quebec, our colleagues in Alberta. I'm a former Mountie. I spent 28 years in British Columbia. I've spoken with my colleagues in charge of the Combined Forces and Special Enforcement Unit and what's commonly known as E Division Major Crime, and it is an emerging issue there. So as this issue continues to grow and develop, we will be as nimble as possible, but we do not yet find ourselves in a position where we've got a task force designed for this specific avenue. But our colleagues in the States have now arrived at that place down in San Diego, was San Francisco, LA. I've saw some presentations and met with some of those investigators.
Thank you. And would anyone else care to comment? Or else I'll jump into my second question asked.
I'd proceed if I
Thank you
may.
very, very much. I also wanted to ask, I heard it mentioned briefly, particularly by you, Mr. Busch, around the red flag laws. And I heard a little bit of your testimony there. We have heard from earlier witnesses that there's a concern with the proposed red flag law, a concern that police officers will tell victims of domestic violence to seek out emergency prohibition or themselves with the usual concerns around inequitable access to justice arising as a result. So I'd like to get your opinions on this and give you a chance to respond. And I'm going to go to Mr. Busch first because you started talking about, you touched on it, and I just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly.
Yeah, thank you very much. The provisions that are within the proposed legislation in Bill C21, to help us combat, again, interpartner violence, or so-called the red flag laws, similar to different legislation enacted in some of the American states, I think it'd be very useful for us dealing with, all that type of violence that happens in our communities. As you know, it's fairly significant issue in a lot of our communities, interpartner violence, and there's such a diversity in thought in amongst the police services across Canada, depending on all the different things that cause us to be so diverse, that it's hard for me to give you a definitive answer that everybody's going to stand up and agree with. But so just based on conversations I had with some of our chiefs, I think I came up with kind of a loose consensus on that.
Senator Richards, I'm afraid we're going to have to move on to Senator Richards now.
Thank you.
You're afraid you're going to have to move on to me. Well,
it was by way of an apology to
no worries.
Yes.
Thank you for being here to the witnesses, and thank you to the chair. Before my question, I just want to say I have 6 police officers, RCMP officers, and city police officers in my family. So I want them to be as safe as everyone else in the country. But I think this law flounders quite a bit, and I think there's a sleight of hand attached to it. So I would like to get Mr. Fordy's views on this. The problem is that we have ghost guns and we have illegal handguns, but in some ways we're associating these two with guns that are legally owned and hunting rifles, and we have kind of put them all together. Although we pretend we haven't, this law really doesn't specify as well as it should. So once again, you are placing lawful gun and gun owners in the same bill as ghost guns and gang handguns. This, to me, is rather irresponsible. And for thousands who are responsible, they can become suspect. And I'm wondering if Mr. Fordy could just comment on this, please.
Okay, thank you for the question, sir, and through the chair. I didn't look at it through that lens, to be honest with you. I thought that I viewed it as, to me, the role that lawful gun owners play is, or where they're potentially impacted is, as some of the other witnesses referenced, the majority of the crime guns that are falling into gang members' hands are coming from the United States. And Texas is the number one source. But that doesn't preclude the fact that some guns are being stolen in Canada from people who, as you referenced, are lawfully own them, and by virtue of that, they're coming into the hands of criminals. So any legislation that comes into place that reduces the potential for that as well, I think also increases the potential for public safety or enhances public safety across the country, particularly in the urban domains where handguns seem to be more prevalent than the long guns, but that's the perspective that I was looking at it.
So that really puts a crimp in in people who are law-abiding, good Canadian citizens who legally own a handgun or for that matter, a hunting rifle. Because someone might at some point in the distant future or the near future break into their house, rifle through all their belongings and steal it. Might you answer that, sir?
So your question is, do I think that that's a possibility, or do I think that's fair?
Well, both. Both. I mean, our property is our own. If somebody's going to come in and tear a place apart and find a gun, whether it's a rifle, a 303, or a 22 handgun, I mean, we cannot be responsible for the world if we are trying to live our best in our own way, legal and proper. We can't decide on these things that might happen in the future.
Okay, I'm afraid we've run out of time, and I suggest that was kind of more of a statement than a question, but that's fair
Okay,
enough.
no worries. I got it in. Thank you.
Senator Cardozo is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to ask our three witnesses. We've had various kinds of testimony, as you're aware. So on the one hand are people such as the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters who are concerned that the culture of handgun use is being seriously undermined by this legislation. And then we heard from a number of organizations that work with women, shelters and so forth, and feel that this legislation is very important because it deals with, because their concern is domestic violence, intimate partner violence is really at crisis proportions, if not an epidemic. And they feel this kind of bill is really important. Could you each give us your thoughts on those two opposing viewpoints? And maybe I'll start with Chief Fordy.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think if I could, I'd start with the issue of domestic violence, if I might. I agree with the perspective that some of the advocacy groups have represented, and that this potentially helps reduce or mitigate violence, intimate partner violence and domestic violence. And on the issue of the red flag law, and I think specifically if it's 110, if I recall correctly, the concern that this might result in the police not taking enforcement action because they would rely on victims or counselors or lawyers or other medical practitioners perhaps to make that claim. I don't see that in law enforcement. I think that police officers recognize that they have a responsibility, either by way of policy or fiduciary responsibility, to deal with those, and that there's been legislation put in place across the country in each province to make that mandatory reporting. So I'm not sure about that. Them moving off of their responsibilities or moving away from those responsibilities. And then I'm sorry, if you could just remind me of the second part of the question.
I guess the anglers and hunters who felt that their lifestyle is being affected by this bill.
Well, I guess in any bill, you'll never have everybody in alignment with respect to what's right or what's wrong. I understand the bill that it does not propose to take any firearms away from out of the hands of kind of the indigenous peoples that use them for hunting or trapping or anything like that. So, I'm not sure I can provide anything beyond that at this point.
Thanks. I'll just ask Mr. Busch, if I can, about your thoughts, especially in regards to indigenous and people in the north who use guns for trapping and for sustenance.
Yes, that's a one of the most common issues that comes up when we're discussing this legislation is that a lot of our communities are very, fearful or insistent that the legislation doesn't infringe on their inherent rights to hunt and harvest animals for food. But at the same time, I think there are aspects of this legislation and other law that would make our communities safer, even if firearms, particularly long guns, are commonly present, and that is the safe storage, making sure that people have the hunter safety training that they need, that the access to guns isn't ready, that they're stored safely, and that the police have the powers they need to look at people who shouldn't have access to guns and to take the necessary measures to prevent them from having that ready access.
Thank you. We have to move on, I'm afraid. We have Senators Beam, Youssef, Carignan and Dasco. I'm going to try to get all four in, so please be mindful of that. Senator Beam.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. My question is for Mr. Deramond. In a communication released by the Association of Police of Quebec on the 19th of February 2021, you indicated that you are in favour of an approach to combat gun violence that would be more widespread, and that the legislation should be the cornerstone of this effort. You raised a number of misgivings concerning the police's ability to enforce this, especially to do with municipalities' capability to enforce. And you referred to this in your opening remarks today. Are these still current concerns? And will the bill in its current form address those issues adequately? Thank you very much for your question, Senator. Yes, the bill does, to an extent, address some of the issues. And that's what we're saying. We're in favour of change, but in my opinion, this is just a good start. There's a lot left to be done. Now, we've referred a lot to the need for a balanced approach. There's the urban approach and the rural approach as well. And the directors of the police forces of Quebec understand this. But when it comes to intimate partner violence or conjugal violence, there are very few offences that are committed with firearms, but when there are firearms involved, it's always tragic, and the end, it's always deadly, oftentimes deadly. So we really need to address that. When it comes to illegal weapons, that also seem to be an issue. I don't know how this legislation will address the illegality of firearms by making those weapons more legal in a sense. So I referred in my opening remarks to training of police officers who have to enforce the legislation, but the more complicated the legislation becomes, the more complex the training needs to be. Now, I think Mr. Busch referred to the issue of Crown prosecutors that have trouble enforcing the legislation and interpreting the legislation. It's not really easy to work with the current legislation, and it will need to be amended. There needs to be more consistency and coherency with the provincial legislation and other legislation.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Youssef.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here, and thank you for sharing your thoughts. I just have one question, I guess, in the context of your responsibilities on behalf of police chief in your jurisdiction and your area. Is C21 an important tool in a broader effort to deal with gun violence from your perspective? I know many of you have spoken on different aspects of that, but each one of you could give me maybe one particular, I guess, example that this bill would be able to assist you in the work you're doing on behalf of police chiefs across the country. With Chief Fordy.
Yes, thank you, sir, for your question and through the chair. I think it is helpful rather than hurtful. I think the stronger language around prohibited firearms is helpful. I think the efforts to reduce domestic violence are helpful. And as the previous witness referenced, kind of the fatality attached to some of those incidents. So in general terms, to be brief, I think it is helpful, yes.
Do you briefly respond?
Au niveau,
Well, as far as Quebec is concerned, we are in favour of the legislation, as I said, but I also said that it was just a good start. And there's a number of aspects being addressed here. That said, the criminal code needs to continue to be amended, and the tools that are given to police officers must be enhanced so that they can address the needs out in the field. For example, to do with ghost guns, there have been a number of amendments, as well as conjugal and intimate-based family violence. They're good things, but that has to be dovetailed with provincial legislation and also the anesthesia legislation that we have in Quebec in the wake of the death of that individual in Dawson College. So as I said, there are some great aspects to the bill, but others are not as good, and we need to focus on those.
Mr. Busch.
Thank you. Yes, I think similar to what my colleagues have told you, their issues are varied depending on the diversity of our police service. Some are almost urban, attached to the major centers, and others are very rural. So some of the things change is different. But I do know, particularly in a lot of our settings, that controls have to be put on the easy access to guns. We have very high rates of suicide. That if guns were stored more properly, that perhaps those we could eliminate a lot of those. Same with any kind of intimate partner violence. There has to be controls, and I know, speaking from the police perspective, our number one thing is to keep our people safe. And some of the ways we do that may not be universally popular in the community, especially when people are concerned about their inherent rights and things like that. But we just want everyone to be safe, and any tool that we can get through legislation can help to do that if it is applied correctly and backed up through our judicial system as well.
Thank you. Thanks very much. We are running out of time quickly, so there are 3 minutes left for each of Senators Carignan and Dasco. Senator Carignan.
Yes, my question is for the Association of Directeurs de Police du Québec, but other witnesses can chime in if you wish. You said that it's quite a complex issue and that a number of factors need to be borne in mind, including the enforcement of arms and weapons trafficking. They are keys to the puzzle, and they're a big part of the issue that we're seeking to address here. Could you please tell me, I heard that there was a significant reduction of RCMP police officers who are in charge of controlling weapons trafficking both in Quebec and Ontario. There are fewer and fewer of them. Now, there's the Sûreté du Québec and the Ontario Police Force, but as far as the RCMP is concerned, why have they cut their workforce in this manner? There are fewer RCMP officers to control the borders and to stem the tide of arms trafficking. And you bear the brunt of this issue. And C21 will in no way address that and a number of other issues, will it? Well, the fact is that the RCMP was part of the Centaur strategy that we implemented in Quebec alongside the Sûreté du Québec and the municipal police forces. Now, I can't speak for the RCMP, but I do know that there was an optimization of resources, and they sent folks to border crossings, to key strategic border crossings. That is a fact. Now, I'll defer. Has there been a cut in staffing in Quebec? Yes, there was some time ago, but now it would seem that there's a redeployment across Quebec as a result of the issues that we're grappling with on the ground. Okay, so when it comes to conjugal violence, what other tools are available currently that might be more effective or as effective and avoid throwing fuel on the fire and limit the conjugal violence? Other tools in the criminal code. We don't want to throw fuel on the fire, as I said. We don't want to put the victim even at greater risk. When you actually have to file a complaint to take away a weapon from someone, that might upset them. Well, in Quebec, we have a specialised court that has just been implemented across the province, and that has helped to address some of the issues. We have the restraining order bracelets that can be worn by offenders as well. So the legislation does play have a coercive approach to it. But one thing is for sure, we shouldn't always put the burden on the shoulders of victims. The police must be involved across the board. We need to make sure that victims are able to file complaints and that things are followed up upon.
Thank you. Our final question for the panel goes to Senator Dasco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. My question is to Mr. Chief Fordy. Now, and it's about the issue of smuggling. Now, of course, we've heard quite often during testimony that smuggling is a problem. We have illegal guns in the country, and sometimes there is a critique of C21 is offered that the bill does nothing to deal with smuggling, but of course smuggling is already illegal. So it's already against the law. And then that would lead one to wonder what should this bill do, if anything, to deal with smuggling. Now, I took from your comments at the beginning of your testimony that you had some suggestions for possible amendments to the bill that would deal with the smuggling issue. I wonder, could you just elaborate what those might be? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for your question. When I made my comments, so I don't have specific recommendations, but I can tell you they would be things like enhanced information sharing, funding put in place, sentencing provisions relative to people that are coming across our country. But on the issue of kind of interoperability and smuggling across the border, I can tell you that in Ontario, the RCMP footprint is expanding. You know, we've created some combined forces special enforcement units, one that is in the actual region that I serve, RCMP led, working with municipal departments and the OPP. So we are seeing that interoperability, sharing of information, sharing of intelligence that maybe others, I gather from my friends' comments in Quebec, maybe they're not experiencing, but in Ontario, we're seeing the RCMP continue to develop a bigger footprint and play a bigger role. You know, I think in the long term, the issue of border security, you know, the CBSA, I think needs to and should play a larger role in that. So I welcome increased funding and legislative authorities provided to them. Allowing them to share more information with us would be helpful.
Can I just take from your comments that you're not actually suggesting amendments to C21? You're suggesting changes and improvements outside of the legislative process in the way programs and enforcement is carried out. Is that,
yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry if I missed.
No, that's good. That's the clarity I was searching for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, this brings us to the end of our panel. I'd like to extend our sincere thanks to Mr. Fordy, Mr. Deramond and Mr. Busch. We greatly appreciate the time you've spent with us and the expertise that you bring to this. We have learned a lot, and so on behalf of my colleagues around the table, thank you. Colleagues, we have a couple of minutes. We've got the next panel waiting, so I ask you to stay in your seats while we turn this over and do a quick sound check, and then we'll commence with the second panel. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Sorry. Next panel. For those tuning into today's meeting, we're exploring Bill C21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments, all respecting the regulation of firearms in Canada. For this next panel, we have the pleasure of welcoming from the Vancouver Police Department Deputy Chief Constable Fiona Wilson, and by video conference on behalf of the RCMP's Combined Forces Special Enforcement Unit in British Columbia, Mandip Mann, Assistant Commissioner, and Joel Hussey, Inspector. Thank you for joining us today. I invite you to provide your opening remarks, to be followed by questions from our members, and I remind you that each organisation has 5 minutes for testimony. We will begin with Deputy Chief Constable Fiona Wilson. Please proceed whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you so much for having me here today. I've been a police officer with the Vancouver Police Department for 25 years and have spent much of my career investigating violent crimes, gang violence, organized crime, and firearm offences. I currently oversee the investigation division that includes, in part, homicide, organized crime, special investigations, cybercrime, and related support units, including surveillance, covert resources, forensic services, and our firearms lab. I've seen firsthand the impact of firearm-related violence on communities across Canada and have watched the proliferation of unlawfully possessed firearms, replica firearms, and prohibited devices such as high-capacity magazines and suppressors. To date in Vancouver, we have had 22 shots fired incidents in 2023, resulting in 3 homicides and 16 people wounded. 15 of the 21 incidents have confirmed or suspected links to gangs. Based on my experience, I believe that the amendments set out in Bill C21 reflect the need for a national approach to reducing firearm-related violence and will give police valuable tools to address firearms crimes in Canada. It is easy to simply remove a rivet from a magazine to increase its capacity, and the dangers that high-capacity magazines create for communities, the police, and offenders themselves are significant. The new offence for altering a magazine will provide police officers with much-needed opportunities for enforcement and investigation. With new offences such as this, police officers gain the ability to charge offenders and apply for judicial authorizations targeting specific offences. Modernizing the legal definition of a replica firearm and placing controls on the importation, exportation, and sale of realistic-looking replicas will help police address the very real use of replica firearms in criminal offences. Additionally, this amendment will help police address the growing trend of altering realistic airsoft guns to fire live ammunition. Red flag laws will allow citizens to access judicially authorized processes to restrict a person's access to firearms and provide police with the authority to search for and seize firearms, and will protect victims of domestic violence and those at risk of self-harm. An ongoing trend is the emergence of privately made firearms, commonly known as ghost guns. We are seeing more ghost guns in the Lower Mainland gang conflict, specifically in the hands of people involved in active murder conspiracies and people believed to be working as hired contract killers. Many years ago, 3D printed guns could fire 1 to 2 rounds before failing. Currently, 3D printed guns manufactured in our VPD lab can fire more than 10,000 rounds without failure. 3D liquid metal printing will further increase this capacity to the point that it will be indistinguishable from a commercially manufactured firearm. The addition of a new category of prohibited firearms to include unlawfully manufactured firearms will allow prosecutors to more easily define such dangerous firearms in court. The addition of the new definition of a firearm part to include barrel and slides will assist with stemming the urgent and real threat from privately made firearms. Currently, barrels and slides are unregulated and ordered in bulk by those who are 3D printing the currently regulated portion of the gun, basically the receiver. Currently, it is lawful to possess computer data that pertains to the printing of 3D printing of personally manufactured firearms. As you all know, C21 will introduce necessary offenses for police to use in all levels of investigations that will make the possession of and sale of such data illegal. With the future threat of 3D metal printing, the printing of slides and barrels at home is only 3 to 5 years away. This section will equip police with tools to combat the ability of criminals to fully print all gun parts at home. I'd also like to support increased funding for specialized firearms enforcement teams to proactively target offenders who import, manufacture, and traffic unlawfully possessed firearms. The CACP has initiated a PMF working group to complement their organized crime committee and the Special Purpose Committee on Firearms to develop a national education strategy. I'd also like to support increased funding for DNA analysis. DNA evidence is often preferred by the Crown as evidence of possession of a firearm. And finally, I'd like to thank the committee for their ongoing work to address the real threats that unlawfully possessed firearms create for communities across Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wilson. Next, we will hear from Assistant Commissioner Mandip Mann. Mr. Mann, please proceed whenever you are ready.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to be with you today. I am RCMP Assistant Commissioner Manny Mann, Officer in charge of the Combined Forces Special Enforcement Unit of British Columbia, or CFSU-BC, and the Chief Officer of the Organized Crime Agency of British Columbia. The mandate of CFSU-BC as BC's Integrated Anti-Gang Unit is to target, investigate, prosecute, disrupt, and dismantle the organized crime groups and individuals that pose the highest risk to public safety due to their involvement in gang violence. With the support of the province of British Columbia and leadership from the Organized Crime Agency of BC, a provincial police agency that works within CFSU-BC, the Crime Guns Intelligence and Investigation Group, referred to as CGIG, was established in 2019. RCMP Inspector Joel Hussey is the officer in charge of CGIG, and he is here with me today and will take many of your questions. The mandate of CGIG is to investigate individuals and groups that are involved in the trafficking, smuggling, and manufacturing of illegal firearms. CGIG is comprised of an intelligence unit, investigative team, and a forensic firearms lab. The CGIG model has allowed for a greater ability to advance firearms investigations, cultivate and share intelligence, as well as provide for timely forensic examinations of firearms. There are areas for future enhancement, but the concept of operations and combining the three areas under one command has allowed for greater operational interoperability and proven to be a best practice. Combating illegal firearms is an extremely important element in the fight against gangs and organized crime. In BC, we have seen a year-over-year increase in the use of privately manufactured firearms by organized crime groups who are likely also drawn to PMFs given they're untraceable. More concerning, shootings involving illegal firearms are occurring in public spaces such as restaurants, retail parking lots, and parks, which risk the lives and safety of innocent bystanders and erodes public feelings of safety. Although the number of PMFs seized overall is not significant, it is clear that the trend of using PMFs is growing as handguns become less accessible. The use of converted airsofts and 3D printed firearms is also now becoming a common occurrence in many of our investigations, both in large centers and smaller communities in BC. It can also be very lucrative in that a firearm can be 3D printed for under $1,000 and sold for several thousand on the black market. As the complexity of cases and use of novel 3D designs increases, we expect greater pressure on our firearm support services. These complex cases require significant time, skill, and expertise to conduct the firearm analysis and to prove the firearm to be operational for the purposes of court. As such, reducing the availability, use, and impact of illegal firearms is a primary focus of CGIG as well as CFSU-BC. The possession and distribution of computer data used in producing 3D firearms using a variety of tools is a trend that we are seeing in our illegal firearms investigations. Our intelligence capabilities are currently being modernized in anticipation that organized crime groups will attempt to circumvent any new restrictions such as firearm parts by turning to the dark web. To do this, we are working closely with our national and international partners, as well as academia, to advance both our own understanding of the dark web landscape and its future risks, as well as identifying enforcement opportunities to reduce the illegal smuggling of firearms and parts. Finally, the tracing of firearms remains a top priority for our organizations and is critical in understanding how organized crime groups obtain illegal firearms. Since its inception, the CGIG intelligence team has made significant progress in implementing a new process to appropriately capture firearm seizures and trace all crime guns in BC. In recent months, the National Firearms Tracing Center has established tracing capabilities in BC, which has increased tracing of firearms and allowed for greater understanding of our crime gun landscape. Through tracing, we can identify the suppliers of illegal firearms and take appropriate action. CGIG efforts to trace firearms are consistent with the intent of C21 to reduce gun violence. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today and share our experiences from BC.
And thank you very much, Assistant Commissioner. We will now move to questions. This panel will conclude at 5:10 p.m. and I will be limiting questions and answers to 4 minutes. I will hold up this card to indicate that there are 30 seconds remaining in your time, so please keep your questions succinct and identify the person you're addressing the question to. That being said, the first question goes to our Deputy Chair, Senator Dagenet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. My first question is directed at Mr. Mann. Mr. Mann, we know that a big part of the problem of the trafficking of illegal weapons and a number of the seizures, of course, is that they come from the border between the US and Canada, which is porous. Now, politicians are promising results by announcing million-dollar investments, but beyond money, there's an issue of mobilisation and a lack of vision, in my opinion. So let's set aside this reassuring and political rhetoric. I'd like the figures on the increase in your staffing over the past 2 years. How many more staff do you have to fight the illegal traffic of weapons? How many men and women, how many more police officers have been deployed across the country, out in the field, and where do they work mainly?
Thank you for your question.
It was for Mr. Mann, the question.
Mr. Mann.
Thank you for your question, sir. With respect to resources, I don't have the exact numbers with me with respect to increase in resources of the past number of years and staffing. Those are numbers that we can certainly take back and provide to you. But with respect to smuggling, I can say that we do work with our U.S. counterparts and to share intelligence and information to advance any investigations that arise from the border.
My second question is for Ms. Wilson. Ms. Wilson, in Montreal, in Toronto, we know that organised crime is well and truly there. Can you hear me properly? You can hear me. This is the interpretation. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. This is the interpretation. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. So I'll just start my question again. We know that both in Montreal and Toronto, for example, organised crime is rampant, as well as in Vancouver. Do you believe that the government could have gone further to help your police officers to combat gangs, street gangs, that don't use registered firearms? How could the legislation be amended to help in your fight against organised crime and gangs who use illegal weapons, I should say in passing?
So I think there are parts of Bill C21 that certainly do address that with respect to sentencing. But for us, any legislation that's enacted that gives us further tools to investigate people who are unlawfully in possession of firearms is very useful. And you know, we recognize that many people are lawful gun owners. Those are obviously not the people that we are concerned about from an organized crime gang perspective. And the provisions in Bill C21 do give us additional tools in order to start our investigations, many of which arise from the simple possession of unlawful firearms.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Never. Okay, merci.
We now move to Santa Platte, to be followed by Santas Maville de Chêne, Deakin, Ontario, Richards, Beam and Cardozo. Santa Platte.
Thank you, Chair. My first question as well will be for Deputy Chief Wilson. And actually, in both of the testimonies I heard here this afternoon, the biggest emphasis was on illegal guns. And of course, we're all supportive of clamping down on illegal guns and smuggled guns. The bill, however, deals with legal guns, not illegal guns. We already have laws. The way I understand it, every gun that a person owns right now has to be registered. Ghost guns, I don't think, are registered. 3D guns are not registered. I'm not sure, Deputy Chief, where we're using those, and I support that. I support clamping down on that. But how does that deal with C21? Those guns don't deal with C21. They have nothing to do with C21. Sorry, that was a comment, and that's supposed to be a question, I guess. Your comment on that, please.
So there's no question that the majority of lawful gun owners follow the rules, and I agree with you. Those are absolutely not the people that we're concerned about with respect to gun violence in our city. However, any legislation that gives us additional tools to address people who are in possession unlawfully of firearms is something that we welcome, and certainly there's provisions in this bill that do just that. You know, there's also the notion that people who lawfully possess and store firearms, we have seen instances in Vancouver where both break-in enters to residences and break-in enters to sellers of firearms have resulted in additional firearms being on our streets and getting into the hands of people who are not using them in a lawful way. And so I think that's a consideration as well with respect to Bill C21, that anything that can reduce or restrict the likelihood of that happening is welcome. You know, there's also one of our primary concerns in Vancouver is with respect to privately made firearms, and there's quite a bit in Bill C21.
Again, illegal already.
That currently addresses some of the gaps there, though, in this bill, particularly with respect to parts, for example, and also the data sharing that's required to manufacture those ghost guns. So that's something that we welcome as well.
So you're suggesting that in order to catch one criminal, we should penalize 100,000 legal gun owners? I know that's a comment, not a question, and you don't need to comment on that. The other question I do have, however, is on the red flag law. What does the red flag law do that you cannot already do without the red flag law? You have all the capabilities of doing exactly what the red flag law allows, and I can call you right now if I'm living beside somebody that I think is illegally possessing a gun. I can call you right now and do that. We don't need this red flag law for that, do we?
So once again, I think that anything that provides police and victims of crime with additional resources to try and address some of the violence associated with domestic violence situations involving individuals who are in lawful possession of firearms is welcomed by police.
I'm sure there won't be a second round, but if there is,
you're on it.
Put me on. Thank you.
Senator Meville-Deschênes is next.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I'll be continuing in French, Ms. Wilson. Now, hot on the in the footsteps of my colleague Senator Plett, but with a different perspective, I'd like to talk about conjugal, domestic, intimate partner violence. And we've heard that this legislation won't do anything when it comes to unlawful weapons, but when one thinks of violence against women, isn't it true that legal weapons are used, in fact, probably in the majority of cases, and you can perhaps clarify and shed light on that, in order to attack one's spouse or injure one's spouse?
Yes, we definitely see that. Interestingly, we see the two places where lawful gun ownership is used in those, circumstances, in unlawful circumstances, would be with respect to domestic violence situations, but also shootings of police officers, interestingly. You may recall the shooting of Constable John Davidson in Abbotsford in 2017 with a legally acquired firearm. 6 police officers in Saanich, British Columbia in 2022 were also shot with, 2 were wounded with a legal firearm in that situation. So those are 2 situations. Domestic violence absolutely is one of them. And the shootings that involve police officers as victims, those are 2 scenarios where we're certainly talking about lawful gun ownership. And with respect to domestic violence situations, as I previously said, any tools that we have as police, and I agree with the previous speaker that, this isn't always going to be a situation where it's just left to the victim to advance the prohibition. As police, we have a duty of care. We have we are heavily invested in investigations with respect to domestic violence when people do have the strength and courage to come forward, and any additional tools we have to try and keep that individual or those families safe are welcome.
Now, are there any provisions of this legislation that, in your opinion, will help to attack the root cause of domestic violence and perhaps reduce the scourge of it?
I don't know about the root cause of domestic violence, but I do know that, as a policing agency, we have significant concerns about someone who's prone to domestic violence, and we've seen that in a number of cases across the country, utilizing lawfully owned firearms against their victims. And so, as I say, anything that gives us tools to try and combat that are much appreciated.
Do I have any time left? Just a short amount of time. Well, I'll be quick in that case. In your opinion, this red flag law, emergency prohibition order, there's been a lot of criticism of it insofar as it would place the burden on the shoulders of victims. Do you think that this is a good thing? Do you think that you can blow the whistle and at the same time protect the victim and their identity?
Absolutely. These victims are already in a position of extreme vulnerability, and their safety planning, their safety concerns are already something that we are addressing in any event. I can't see how one would argue that the prohibition would further the likelihood of violence when we're talking about someone who is already in a situation where they have been subjected to, in some cases, very, very extreme, concerning levels of violence already.
Merci.
Thank you. Senator Deacon.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you all our witnesses for being here. I want to just come back to the opening comments you made with respect to ghost guns. And I certainly don't want you to repeat everything, but what I'm looking at is, do you think there's anything else that it might be missing in that section of the bill that would make it stronger Is this section sufficient enough, first of all?
Yeah, we were very pleased to see the provisions in C21 with respect to ghost guns. Our concerns, of course, are the parts that can be purchased by anyone without a license in large quantities. We've certainly seen that in Vancouver. We had an investigation in Vancouver, as a matter of fact, where we had a person who was making a high number of privately manufactured ghost guns in their home, and had actually ordered in excess, in one order, of 50 parts, components to facilitate putting those firearms together. So we're very pleased about that. Very pleased to see the computer data piece in there. I think that's a creative way to address that issue. Of course, not being able to prohibit the use of a 3D printer, but we do know, and we've created these in our own lab in Vancouver, that the blueprints are necessary in order to make the firearm, and prohibiting the possession of that, I think, is very, very useful. So we're actually very pleased with what we see in Bill C21 with respect to ghost guns.
Okay, thank you. And for further witnesses, started carrying on with what my colleague asked you. While this legislation does not ban semi-automatic weapons, it will ban those firearms created with a new design after coming in force of the amended definition. I think it's fair to say that there are a number of recreational shooters, as mentioned earlier, that feel aggrieved by this future prohibition. Many believe they will need these firearms for the future. But I'm just wondering, in your area, and I'm looking at these pieces, have you had the conversation outside of the cities, but also with being called in or with expertise from our hunters? And if not, if I've got time left, I will shift. I was just wondering about that from your jurisdictions. My colleague also talked about gun violence and the ultimate root cause of gun violence. And you're on the ground, all of you, every day dealing with these perpetrators of violence. If not this legislation, then what can be done to lessen gun violence so that we're keeping people alive and well instead of pulling the trigger?
Who's the question going to?
I'd like to hear from our folks who are virtual.
Okay. So, Mr. Mann.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll ask Inspector Hussey to follow up on that one, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you very much for that question. As ACOM Mann mentioned in his opening remarks, we have our CGIG team, which is combined of enforcement team, intel team, as well as our lab. So we are very active in the focused strategic enforcement on organized crime members and associates who utilize illegal firearms and that pose a risk to public safety. So we deal with the manufacturing, trafficking, and smuggling of we work a lot with our partners provincially. Also, we have people within our CGIG team that are seconded NWest South, ATF, and also Homeland Security. We work, we do many conventional and unconventional techniques in order to advance our investigations, and have been very successful in doing so. As far as what can be done to handle more, we always look for new techniques and try to keep up with technology, and also use as many techniques as we can to be able to stop this type of violence that's happening and being perpetrated by high-level criminals. So what more can be done to handle it? I believe that we're doing everything we can through our collaboration, through our intel gathering, and through our effectiveness investigations.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. We're just having a little bit of trouble with the connection, and we'll try and get that sorted out in due course. The next question goes to Senator Richards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here and for your service. Ms. Wilson, ghost guns are illegal, and they should be illegal. But there's no way to stop them, is there? Even with this legislation, there's really no way to stop them. And I'm wondering if this law will improve the capacity to mitigate them.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess you could say that about any type of crime. At the end of the day, it's very hard to have a complete cessation of crimes through legislation, through case law, whatever the case may be. But we do feel that there's a lot of room for improvement with respect to ghost guns, and we do see that improvement in this bill. And as I mentioned earlier, the ability for Crown to be able to more effectively define what a ghost gun is in court is very important. The new definition of a firearm part to include the barrel and slides will assist with stemming the urgent and real threat from privately made firearms. That's a very, very important piece of this, as I just explained in that real-life example from Vancouver just a number of months ago. But also, we're confident that we are going to be seeing 3D liquid metal printing in the next couple of years, and this bill will also address that with respect to the parts. We think that there's a good opportunity to address the restricting gun parts through the existing PAL process, through the existing provisions that are in place in terms of lawful gun ownership, so that people who are lawful gun owners who do need to change and update parts from time to time are still able to do that, but not allowing somebody who is not a lawful gun owner to order massive amounts of these parts to facilitate ghost guns. So I think there's a lot, as I mentioned, in this bill that is important with respect to ghost guns. Of course, we're never going to be able to actually completely eliminate the ability of people to create privately manufactured firearms, but I think the provisions in this bill go a long way to assist police with investigative avenues and with tools that we can use to try and investigate these types of situations, but also hold offenders accountable when we do come across them, either manufacturing these or in possession of ghost guns.
Okay, and I have a quick second question, and there are two questions that you've dealt with, so I'm going to ask you again. Are you concerned at all, or is the police concerned at all? Because I'm concerned about this. I think a lot of people are, that the red flag law can be misused and abused in order to target innocent people.
No.
You don't think that could happen?
I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but the benefit of having that in place and the protection of victims in domestic violence situations in particular, I think outweighs the unlikely possibility that that provision could be abused.
But don't you think we have that already in place?
As I said earlier, I think any tools that we have access to and that victims of crime have access to that can further their safety is something that we welcome.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Beam to be followed by Senators Cardozo, Youssef, Dasco and Carignan. Senator Beam.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. And my question is for Deputy Chief Wilson. Thank you for being with us here. According to the City of Vancouver website, more than 21,000 people have lost their lives to overdoses across British Columbia since 2016, when the overdose crisis was declared a public health emergency. So that's 7 years ago. And of course, in Vancouver, that's the epicenter of this. So the opioid crisis is not unique to Vancouver. and to BC, of course. But what I'm wondering is, given the particular level of crisis for so many years, so many more years than it's been documented, let's say, in the rest of the country, where do firearms fit into the daily work of your department? I would think that there would be a significant strain on police forces to be able to respond effectively to both the drug crisis and to firearms, along with everything else. So I'm wondering whether you could tell us a little bit about the strain on resources, and if the proposed red flag provisions in the bill will reduce that strain and help police in Vancouver do their work more effectively.
So certainly in Vancouver, we've seen the proliferation of a number of what I would call maybe not so much crises. Certainly the opioid situation is a crisis, but when we look at the increase in protests in our city, when we look at the opioid crisis, when we look at the proliferation of gangs and violence associated to that, there's always competing resource challenges. There's no question about that. With respect to domestic violence situations, we have a domestic violence unit. And so the resources that would be directed towards that certainly are distinct from the resources that we direct in our organized crime section and our frontline members with respect to the opioid crisis. So, generally speaking, from a resource perspective, we are constantly trying to balance our resources under the weight of an increasing workload. There's no question about that. However, the provision with respect to domestic violence situations and being able to prohibit a lawful gun owner in situations where they've known to engage in violence, I can't see that will necessarily add another significant layer of work for our members. I understand that it's something that a victim could advance in the absence of police, and I think there's value in that. I think we often come across situations where victims are not willing to come forward to police, and it's a tool for them in the absence of that they could still utilize. And as far as our members, our police officers taking on this additional task, I think it's something that we would welcome, because we end up being so invested in those investigations, and anything that we can use to further protect victims and families in those situations, as I say, is welcome. So certainly resources are a huge issue. I don't think that provision in particular is going to necessarily lighten our load, but I don't think that despite any added work, I think that would be welcome in any event.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Cardoza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Deputy Chief Constable Fiona Wilson and Assistant Commissioner Mandip Mann. I wonder if you could just educate us a little more about personally manufactured firearms. We hear a lot about them. I had the opportunity to tour the Firearms Center at the RCMP just this morning, and some of the things you mentioned were there, in as much as you see the early ones and they're kind of clunky white plastic, and the new ones are black and look like a real gun. What should we be expecting over the next few years? What should we be concerned about? And of course, these things don't come with numbers on them, but you could just put a false number on them, couldn't you? Or just make up a number. I'm just wondering about all of that. So, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so we're definitely seeing an increase in these types of firearms. And as you would have seen this morning, the quality of firearms is really quite extraordinary. We've made a number of them in our own lab at the VPD and have test fired those extensively. And we actually have one of the people who works in our lab, it also happens to be a machinist, and he was able to actually, in the lab, make the parts so that he was able to create a fully functional
So he could make the metal parts.
Firearm, that's right. So I think that we are likely to see more and more of these as technology improves and as the ability of 3D printers improves. And also, as we see, and we've actually seen this in the United States, this business of 3D liquid metal printing, I think we're only a couple of years off of that as well. So getting to a place where there's no need to order any parts from anywhere, and the entire firearm can be printed on a 3D liquid metal printer. I think that we're going to see more of these. We certainly have increasingly in Vancouver over the years, year over year, seen more and more of these privately made firearms. And as I said, we had essentially a lab that was operating in our city that we took down just a number of months ago that was very, very sophisticated and was churning out a high number of high quality firearms that were all handguns. That were being sold in our city. So I think this is something that we're going to see more and more of, and any regulations we can put in place are very much appreciated from a policing perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. If I probably have a minute or so. You're on mute.
Mute.
Is that better?
Yep, it is. Thank you.
Sorry about that, Mr. Chair. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, certainly with privately manufactured firearms, in the last few years, especially here in the last year and even 6 months, we've seen more and more seizures by our teams throughout the province, including, smaller communities across the province. And Inspector Hussey oversees our CGIG team. I'm going to turn it over to him for some more specifics. But we are seeing more and more, and especially, they have now, unfortunately, also certainly proliferated across the province.
Any thoughts you have about what we can expect in the next couple of years on this?
Yeah, I will take that. So maybe perhaps I could just provide some statistics on PMF seizures. For the province of BC, in 2018, there were 2. In 2019, there were 9. In 2021, there were 39. 22, up to September 30th, there were 34. So BC is yet to experience a high number of PMFs. However, law enforcement agencies are noticing a year-over-year rise in seizures and the criminal use of these types of firearms. It's an emerging trend, and year after year, they keep going up. It's a challenge for law enforcement. It's a fast-growing phenomenon. Low barrier to entry. It's inexpensive. Little skill is required, and there's a high return on investment.
Thank you.
It's putting the public.
Thank you to the witness. I'm afraid we have to proceed. Senator Youssef, you are next.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witness for being here. C21 have a whole number of myriad of new tools available to frontline officers in trying to do their job. And given the complexity and the challenge you face, I can't begin to imagine all the difficulty. But more importantly, would you say that the new tools that is provided in C21 will greatly enhance the role of police officers in doing their job a bit more effective than currently?
Yes, I do think that C21 will enhance our ability to do our job with respect to people who are unlawfully in possession of firearms. We require offenses to start investigations, and Bill C21 gives us more tools to investigate those people who are unlawfully in possession of firearms, and that's helpful.
And maybe both witnesses could answer this next question. Smuggling of illegal firearms coming across the border is an issue. I think there's no dispute about that, and interdiction is a critical part of it. But with the proliferation of technology in manufacturing illegal guns in this country, you don't have to do it across the border. The tools that's now provided to interdict domestic manufacturing of illegal guns in this country is going to greatly enhance in terms of the provision in C21 from both of your perspective?
Yes.
Mr. Mann?
You're on mute again, Mr. Mann. Can you try again?
Can you hear me okay, sir?
Yes, yes.
Sorry about the technical issues. No, for sure, any tools, legislative tools that may be enacted will certainly enhance our police investigations and allow us to further expand investigation into any newer offenses that are introduced.
CGIG, as you referred to, is a new, I guess, a new establishment of this new, I guess, enhanced way of collaborating across borders and across forces. Can you talk about the creation of this CGIG and, of course, its function so far in interdicting and trying to build collaboration across borders in dealing with, of course, illegal guns and gangs across our country, but also in relationship to our American friends?
No, certainly. The CGIG team was born out of the Illegal Firearms Task Force from 2017. So CGIG started in 2019, and like we said earlier, consists of a firearms lab, an intelligence component, and an investigative team. So they're able to work together without barriers, and we believe that's a best practice. There's a high level of intelligence sharing, not only within the team, but with our law enforcement partners within this province and across the country and internationally. So we see certainly continued cooperation and collaboration between police agencies, which allows us to share intelligence and advance our investigations more effectively. Inspector Husty, anything else to add to that?
Yes, just the makeup of CGIG within our team is the firearms enforcement team is 12 members that are dedicated to that, the manufacturing, trafficking, and smuggling investigations, 5 within our provincial intelligence team, and then also 11 within the lab, our provincial forensic lab.
Thank you very much. We go now to Senator Daska.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. First of all, Chief Wilson, I'm very happy to hear about your endorsement of the red flag provisions in the bill. That's very, very good. Canadians themselves strongly support this, and I'm really, really pleased to hear your fulsome support for this very important provision. However, I wanted to ask you about the handgun freeze in the bill. And as you know, C21 would implement a freeze on the sale, purchase, transfer, and importation of handguns. So I just want to get a sense from both witnesses, if you wouldn't mind just telling me what you think the impact of this is going to be. Is it in terms of the presence of guns in the country? And in terms of public safety, is this going to have a significant impact on your work and on the crime scene and the harm that guns do generally? So I guess that's my first question. And then I would ask, do you think this bill should have even gone further than this provision to have place even further restrictions on handguns in Canadian society? So questions to both witnesses that question to both witnesses.
Manny, would you like to go first on this one?
Yes. For our team, our focused strategic enforcement is on high-level organized crime and their associates and their illegal use of firearms. We go after those that are using firearms that are putting the public at risk. So the freeze on handguns, it's only so much as how it affects our engagement and our targeting of high-level organized crime. That's our focus. The actual what is happening at C21 is a tool that allows us to investigate crime guns, and we always welcome new and innovative ways to combat gang and gun violence. So if this legislation is passed, I would look forward to incorporating it into some of our investigative strategies.
Thank you.
And I would agree with that. I think that our focus is certainly on organized crime and people who are committing violence in our communities that are certainly not lawful gun owners. Should the bill have gone further, I think that the bill strikes a good balance between respecting the rights of lawful gun owners and also giving police more tools to address violence associated with guns in this country. And, we'll continue to target our efforts with respect to people who are, not lawful gun owners, because they are typically not the people, with the exception of domestic violence and police shootings where police are the victims. We're generally, not seeing lawful gun owners who are responsible for the shootings, certainly that we're seeing in the city of Vancouver. Without exceptions, those are firearms that are not lawfully possessed in the first instance. And so we will continue to focus on that, and certainly Bill C21 gives us a few more tools to do that.
Thank you. Thanks very much. The final question for this panel goes to Senator Carignan.
My question is for Ms. Wilson. A number of witnesses have said that the more tools we have to fight, the better off we are at the end of the day. But shouldn't we instead be aiming to have the best tools in order to achieve our objectives? Let me give you an example of that line of thinking. I read clause 1.2.1, and there's a complaint against Google, right, that's made. And it says an offence, anyone who has or possesses data, etc., 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 commits an offence or distributes or publishes or makes available data as to how to manufacture a weapon. So in the space of 2 minutes, I Googled the issue and I landed upon a site on how to manufacture a weapon and how to print in 3D format parts of a firearm. Are you going to prosecute Google? Go after Google?
So my understanding is that, and I'd have to read the exact wording again, but my understanding is that it's the possession of the blueprints. But I would have to read that again and go over it. But I think that that's something that would probably be better answered by someone from the prosecution service at the end of the day. And we would have to have an opportunity, if this bill goes through, we would have to have an opportunity to fully review it and study it and understand.
So that's not our job to do that now.
But fully understand what has been put in place.
Not after royal assent. That should be done now, says the senator.
Publie ou rend accessible.
Publish or make available electronic data. Now, Google's provided me with available data here, hasn't it? So should I look at this clause and say that Google has committed an offence under X, Y, or Z clause of this legislation?
So I would have to take a closer look at the legislation and how it applies. Though at the end of the day, if Google is making those blueprints available, then certainly that's something we would have to look at from an enforcement perspective. If the objective is to not, to ensure that people don't have access to those blueprints because they're being used to manufacture firearms, then certainly that's something we would have to look at from an enforcement perspective.
My second question, you referred to DNA. The bill will help you to use DNA for your purposes. I'm trying to wrap my head around that. Could you explain further?
Yeah, so what I was saying is that I would support increase funding for DNA analysis. So DNA evidence is often what's preferred by Crown to prove possession of a firearm, and without a violence index offense like a shooting or a homicide, it's difficult for us to access DNA analysis in a timely manner because the federal lab has criteria that we have to adhere to before they'll actually take a submission for a DNA analysis. And so increased funding for firearms related to DNA testing would be something that I would certainly advocate for. And that's what I was referring to with respect to DNA.
Okay. Ça, c'est un autre outil.
And that's another tool.
Thanks very much, colleagues. This brings us to the end of what has been a very informative panel. I think you will agree. I want to thank you, Deputy Chief Wilson, Assistant Deputy Mann, and Inspector Hussey for joining us today and for sharing your considerable expertise with us and for providing thoughtful advice. While we're here, we thank you for the work that you and your colleagues do every day to keep us all safe, and those colleagues across the country. So thanks very much for that. We're very grateful for the work you do. Colleagues, we'll now suspend for a short health break and we'll return for our third panel at 5:20 p.m. Thank you. Colleagues, we'll now continue with our third and final panel of the meeting today. For those tuning in, we are examining Bill C21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments respecting the regulation of firearms in Canada. We now have the pleasure of welcoming Stéphane Wall, Supervisor, Retired Service de Police de la Ville de Montréal, and André Gélina, Detective Sergeant, Retired Intelligence Division, again Service de Police de la Ville de Montréal. And by video conference, on behalf of the Customs and Immigration Union, National President Mark Webber. Thank you for joining us today. I invite you to provide your opening remarks, to be followed by questions from our members. And I remind you that you each have 5 minutes for your testimony. We will begin this afternoon with Mr. Webber. Mr. Webber, whenever you're ready, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Mark Webber. I'm the National President of the Customs and Immigration Union, which represents personnel working for the Canada Border Services Agency. On February 1st, 2022, I appeared as a witness in front of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security as part of their study on gun control, illegal arms trafficking, and gun crimes. As part of my testimony, I highlighted a series of issues affecting border operations in general and undermining the CBSA's ability to control the flow of illegal firearms. This includes long-standing and widespread understaffing, major operational gaps impacting highway, marine, and rail modes of operation, and the need for increased reliance on CBSA officers' expertise, including between ports of entry. This was almost 2 years ago. I take no joy in telling you that as of today, nothing has changed. The agency's ability to stem the flow of illegal firearms has not improved a bit. Instead of seeing meaningful movement toward an agency that would be better staffed and better equipped to deal with emerging transborder public safety issues, what the past 2 years have made evident is that CBSA continues to pursue ill-fated, costly, and poorly managed automated tools such as ArriveCan, instead of focusing on bolstering its existing resources and developing effective tools and strategies to protect Canadian communities. Nothing's changed. The agency's frontline personnel is still overworked, with many facing exhaustion due to sustained understaffing. Border officers still lack the ability to act between ports of entry, making it harder to address problematic situations in a timely fashion. Tools such as mobile X-rays that could help in intercepting illegal contraband, including dangerous firearms, frequently break down. There is still an almost 0% chance that any illegal weapon entering the country through rail would ever be found. And again, nothing's changed there. If I tell you all of this, it is not to be alarmist, but to highlight how much has to be done to reinforce our border services and how much of an opportunity the government has with Bill C21 to really improve Canada's ability to do something about illegal firearms. When then Public Safety Minister Mendicino spoke in favor of the bill, he made it clear that one of the goals was to take on illegal gun smuggling in a very real and concrete way. As it stands, in the union's opinion, the proposed legislation is insufficient in that regard and needs to be accompanied by other measures if the government wishes to engage with the issue beyond playing security theater. I do wish to acknowledge the work of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security, whose members clearly worked hard to improve the bill given its limitations. For example, in its current form, the bill does introduce language granting new authority for border officers to seize specialized ammunitions and cartridge magazines, which is long overdue. At the end of the day, however, far more is needed to address illegal gun smuggling, and Bill C21 is clearly not the legislative tool needed for that job. Far more needs to be done. On the CBSA front, the agency and our membership would benefit from adequate staffing levels, proper equipment, improved training facilities, and even equitable retirement benefits to help with workforce renewal. On the legislative end of things, we truly need the government to look at addressing long-standing gaps in existing legislation, namely the Canada Border Services Agency Act and the Framework Agreement on Integrated Cross-Border Maritime Law Enforcement Operations between Canada and the U.S., also known as the Shipwrighter Agreement. Changes to these documents would empower border officers to operate between ports of entry, helping to interdict illegal firearms. I'm not a legislative expert, and I'll leave it to you to decide if these changes can be incorporated as part of Bill C21. If they cannot, I urge the government to consider additional legislation to see this addressed promptly. In conclusion, it's my hope that the union's input will assist this committee in this important work. I thank you and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weber. We are going to hear now from Mr. Wall. Whenever you're ready, please proceed.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chairperson, I was a Montreal police supervisor and retired in 2020. I work with the media and elected representatives to demystify the profession and the reality on the ground. You will hear from my colleague André Gélinas. On January 26, 2022, in 2 letters to the media, we proposed a series of concrete preventative and enforcement measures. To the various levels of government in order to combat gun violence. We are apolitical and talk with representatives from all political parties. We believe that legislators, in the face of the trivialisation of violence in Canada, must pass laws aimed at the right targets, i.e. violent criminals such as street gang members and organised criminals who use the vast majority of the time illegal firearms to commit their crimes. Bill C-75, enacted in 2019, made it easier to release violent armed criminals without any real monitoring of their parole conditions. Bill C-5, passed in 2022, abolished mandatory minimum sentences, even for serious crimes, including weapons possession, discharging, or armed robbery. The Parole Act, which allows violent criminals to be released on conditions that are not really monitored, a system that is overwhelmed and where commissioners are not accountable for their decisions, has led to a loss of life in many communities. One need only think of Eustacio Gales, who killed Marilyn Levesque, and many others. Bill C-21 isn't aimed at the right target. It's cosmetic, ideological measure that will do nothing to reduce the number of shootings at the hands of violent criminals, 90% of whom use illegal firearms, from across the border and on Indigenous reserves. If I might venture to offer the following analogy. At present, in Canada, there is a problem of impaired driving, which causes many deaths and injuries at the hands of road criminals. I ask, would the legislator's solution be an across-the-board ban on automobiles, which can be a deadly weapon, impacting law-abiding motorists holding a valid driver's licence? The answer is obviously no. Now, my question is, how can Bill C-21, which targets lawful licensed owners of firearms for hunting or sport shooting, be a concrete, pragmatic solution to the problem of gun violence committed by violent criminals in Canada? The laws I cited have not helped reduce crime rates. On the contrary, we've seen a rise in the sense of impunity on the part of violent criminals, whose street gang members are already bragging on social media and in their videos that circulate as part of the gangster rap culture. We've seen a trivialization of gun violence and sexual and domestic violence against women and even children, with so-called quote-unquote Netflix sentences served at home in the living room, even for serious crimes, with no real monitoring of parole conditions and no concrete access to rehabilitation programs, doubly or triply victimising victims. We've seen an increase in the crime rate, as reflected in data from StatsCan 2022. Police recorded crime in Canada rose for the second year in a row, up 4%. The crime severity index rose in 2022 to its highest level since 2007. And according to Statistics Canada in 2001-2022, we saw a meteoric rise in the number of homicide and femicide victims already overrepresented in Aboriginal, Black and marginalised communities. The same overrepresentation of violent criminals can be also seen in Canada's penitentiaries. Between 2021 and 2022, the homicide rate among the racialised population was 2% higher in 2022 than in 2021. Aboriginal Indigenous peoples had a homicide rate 6 times higher than non-Indigenous persons. In 2022, it was almost 7 times higher. In 2021, Black people accounted for 49% of so-called racialised homicide and femicide victims. In 2022, they accounted for 43% of homicide victims. Now let's turn our attention to solutions. How can legislators tackle illegal weapons? 1, require a permit to buy any key part needed to build or operate a firearm. 2, better surveillance of the border and of native reserves, Akwesasne, Kanestasne, etc. Add cameras, drones, electronic surveillance, high-speed boats, CBSA, RCMP, SQ, OPP patrols and checkpoints. Increase the number of vehicle inspections on roads close to the border. Increase the number of inspections of all motor vehicles leaving Indigenous reserve by land, sea or air, by having a procedure that obligates the CBSA to lay criminal charges in the case of every seizure. Greater cooperation between the RCMP and US authorities in investigations. Better funding programs for whistleblowers and informants living near the borders and on native reserves. Better training police officers, not only on firearms and on firearms legislation, but also on the characteristics of an armed person. In conclusion, with C21, the legislature should be aiming at the right target, not licensed sports shooters and hunters. In addition to hunters, the legislature should at the very least exempt sports shooters who train regularly, who are registered with a recognised shooting club and who take part in at least one competition per year in order to retain their skills. We believe that in Canada, the rights and freedoms of victims, their loved ones and police officers to life, health and safety should take precedence over the rights and freedoms of violent criminals. Honourable Senators, thank you very much for listening.
Now turn to our final witness of this afternoon, Mr. Lennard. Please proceed whenever you...
Bonjour, Monsieur. Hello, Mr. Chairperson, Senators. My name is André Lennard, and I'm a retired Detective Sergeant with the Intelligence Division of the Montreal Police Department. Throughout my career, I worked in various units, including investigations, street gang intelligence, and the Italian Mafia. I was also on loan to the Correctional Services of Canada, as well as to the National Security and Terrorism Intelligence Unit within the RCMP. I also served in Afghanistan during the war with the European Police Mission and with the US Forces as an intelligence trainer and advisor. For approximately 3 years, I've been a police news analyst for various TV, radio and print media outlets. I've been invited to appear before you today to share my knowledge and expertise on various aspects of Bill C21. Before going any further, I'd like to make it clear that my presence here is apolitical and non-partisan. I'm not a member of a lobby or pressure group. Over the past year, I've met with and supported Liberal, Conservative and Bloc Québécois MPs. Bill C21 intervenes in an area that is crucial and essential to the collective safety of our fellow citizens. An effective gun control regime is essential, but it must also be based on a pragmatic, rational and judicious analysis of the situation that prevails in our communities. Bill C21, as it stands, does not attain the objective we have a right to expect. It will not significantly improve public safety because it does not target the root causes of the problem afflicting our society when it comes to firearms. Bill C21 imposes a freeze on the sale and import of legal handguns used by licensees who legitimately use them for target shooting activities. It also targets hunters and certain hunting weapons. However, we know full well that the root causes of gun violence has overwhelmingly to do with two factors. First, the criminal activities of groups such as street gangs, criminal biker gangs, and various mafia groups, including the Italian mafia. Two, through the use of illegally acquired, illegally used, and illegally imported weapons by unlicensed criminals. This assertion is supported by the fact that currently over 90% of handguns seized during searches or as a result of criminal offences are illegally imported from the USA. Interestingly, in 2021, according to StatsCan, a firearm was present in only 2.6% of all violent crimes. The problem of gun violence, is therefore concentrated in certain criminal activities and those of criminalised groups. C21 implies that there is a causal link between urban violence and legal handguns. However, this assertion is false and the result of emotive, ideologically driven lobbying, certainly not based on facts observable by police officers out in the field, as demonstrated by statistics that I just cited. It's important for you, senators, to understand that the crux of the firearms issue has to do with illegal weapons, criminals, and firearms smuggled from our neighbour to the south, with which we share an 8,900-kilometre border. Even if we succeeded in wiping out all legal weapons in Canada, this would barely scratch the surface because of the excessively permissive regime that prevails in neighbouring countries. C21 does not concretely address the problem at our border. We, in the policing community, will all know full well that our border is porous and that there are Indigenous territories where the rule of law does not apply as it does elsewhere in Canada. These territories, strategically located along the border and the St. Lawrence Seaway, must effectively controlled if we are able to reduce the quantity of illegal weapons in circulation and curb the number of shootings in our cities. These pose an incalculable risk to our national security in terms of weapons, drugs, and people passing through these territories. C21 must be amended to include provisions that reflect the situation on the ground. No firearms should be acquired without a licence. Police officers must be automatically involved in the whistleblowing process that an individual might engage in before a judge in order to raise their concerns about a licensee. The burden must absolutely not fall on the backs of the victims, and they must also make the flagging system more efficient for health professionals. The bill would also make it mandatory to hold a licence for the possession of ammunition. The government must revise Bill C5 to reinstate mandatory minimum sentences for firearm offences. It must also make penalties for minors consistent with those for adults, taking into account objective seriousness of the offence and the harm caused to victims. We also need to improve police training on firearms law and the detention of armed individuals. In closing, I must also point out the improvements we've seen to the situation in Montreal, Laval and Longueuil this summer come as a result of the hard work of police officers who strategically targeted criminal organisations and high-risk individuals. The improvements are also due to the initiatives of the various Quebec police forces and the provincial government in creating various units dedicated to fight against illegal firearms. It's certainly not due to the 2022 order, which saw its amnesty extended for a further 2 years for a total of 5 years. Thank you, Senators. I'll be delighted to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jonah, and to Mr. Wall and Mr. Weber also. We move to questions now. There are 4 minutes for each question and answer. Remember to identify the person you're sending your question to and be as succinct as possible. There is a 30-second warning flag that we have been using, I think, quite successfully. Let's move to questions then. We start with Senator Dagenet, to be followed by Senators Plett, Maville Duchesne, Cardozo, Deacon, and Carignan. Please indicate if you want to be added to the list. Senator Dagenet, Deputy Chair, starts us off.
Merci. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. My first question is directed at Mr. Wall, and Mr. Gélinas. Now, C21, in my opinion, doesn't have much teeth to deter you young criminals and street gangs that get illegal firearms in the black market. I'd like to take advantage of your experience out in the field, in particular in Montreal. We know that criminals in their hierarchy often call on young people, prey on them to shoot firearms in their place. How can we have a direct and significant impact on that youth? And here's my question. The weapons in the hands of street gangs, is that a legislative or a judicial problem? Often judges' sentences aren't tough enough. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Well, listen, you're entirely right, Senator. When it comes to the coherency of sentencing, we often hear about what we call giveaway or treat sentences. And that is the fact of the matter. Bill C5 abolished mandatory minimum sentences for a whole host of offences that are perpetrated by street gangs and other organised criminals. And youth are raw material for street gangs to prey on. They don't even hide this fact, these street gangs. They openly recruit them and they say, well, you're not even 18 years of age. Nothing much is going to happen to you. You'll end up in a youth centre. You won't end up with a criminal record. And unfortunately, these youth stay in these street gangs. They've had a taste of the money. They've had a taste of the experience, the quote-unquote prestige that those criminal activities give them. They become hardened criminals as adults, and prevention no longer works with them. Prevention only works with those who haven't crossed over to the dark side, if I could put it that way. But that's the fact of the matter. It's a very easy pool that's easily influenced. They often come from broken families and they're looking for a sense of belonging. Sentences need to be consequential, and those individuals also need to be surveilled. If I could just tack on to what my colleague just said. In my opening remarks, I referred to the gangster rap culture that is propagated on social media and through their videos. That trivializes violence and gun violence. That's a fact. And many social media outlets have categorized this, and unfortunately, this women's bodies are exploited in these videos. It's a culture of hatred, easy and quick wealth, that you can get anything you want by means of violence. That attracts some young people. And I don't want to conflate things here, and I'll be careful. When it comes to street gangs in the hot neighborhoods, quote unquote, one needs to understand that we're talking about a minority of individuals. For example, in northern Montreal, a small minority of the youth in those neighborhoods become violent criminals. The lion's share become productive citizens, but there is a small percentage that is attracted by that violence, and in my opinion, the onus is on the legislator to ensure that these videos that promote hatred, that peddle violence, be prohibited. Young people can't be able to share degrading videos on women, exploitation of women, and so on. Do I have time for more questions?
No, I'm sorry. We now move to Senator Platt.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Gélinas, you answered my first question. It had to do with Bill C5, so thank you for that. I was going to delve into that, but you did that well. But I have another question for you. When you testified before the House of Commons Committee on this bill, you noted that the government chose to announce this bill in Montreal North, a borough of the city that is particularly affected by street gangs. You stated before the committee that there is in fact no link between gang violence in Montreal North and firearms illegally held by sport shooters. As many other witnesses have told us, the crime guns seized in Montreal primarily originate in the United States and are smuggled across the border. What impact do you think Bill C21 will have on the problems of gang and gun crime in Montreal?
Merci, Monsieur le Sénateur, pour la question.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. Obviously, C21 won't have a major impact on gangs. Now, as you mentioned, the bill was announced in Montreal North with great pomp and ceremony, and we know full well that the weapons that are being targeted are legally used and owned by law-abiding citizens who bought them with licenses. Now, however, in Quebec, 90% of guns that are seized during searches or in criminal activity come from the United States. And unfortunately, we can't break down that remaining 10%. But in all likelihood, those guns, that 10% of guns, were stolen and stored legally, but then stolen. And of course, robbers can get around anything. And anyone who uses those guns for illegal purposes is very tiny.
Must be very frustrating for officers like yourself when a bill like C21 gets in the way. It must be frustrating officers who have been trying to combat the problem of gang and gun crime in Montreal. But thank you for your service and for continuing the battle. Mr. Weber, a very brief question. In your remarks, you referred to playing with security theater, I think were your words. Can you explain that to me, please?
Yes, I can. Thank you. I think the point that we try to make as the Customs and Immigration Union is that given our staffing levels, given the tools we have available at the border, we could pass any legislation we want regarding firearms. Our ability to interdict those firearms are extremely limited. We know where they're coming from. We heard previous testimony that 90% approximately used in crimes are coming from the United States. Our job is to keep them out of Canada, knowing that they come from the United States. We have no ability to patrol between borders. We don't really inspect rail at all. Marine, we're inspecting less than 1% of shipments that come in. Our staffing levels at land borders, at airports are below critical. So we're really not looking at very much in terms of practically stopping those firearms from getting into Canada in the first place.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Platt. Senator Maville-Deschênes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, my question is for Messieurs Wall and Jelena. One of the goals of C21 is to reduce the number of even legal weapons in circulation. We want fewer firearms because mathematically speaking, fewer firearms should mean fewer crimes. Let me give you an example of this because you were focusing primarily on illegal weapons, but lawful firearms can also kill and cause bodily harm. So from 2011 to 2021, there was over 1,500 murders of men, women, and children, and the most attempted murder of women and girls in the home setting was with using guns that led to bodily harm and injury. And you seem to be minimizing that vis-a-vis gang activities. Now, I'm not claiming that gang activities aren't the main cause of casualties and gun-related violence. I'm not denying that. But wouldn't it behoove us also to try and reduce the number of lawful firearms in Canada to avoid situations where females are victims, particularly in a home setting? Madam Senator, I'm not casting any doubt regarding those statistics, but based on the most recent statistics, only 2.6% of all violence of this type was using guns. Now, as a patroller myself, I intervened in the case of thousands of cases of domestic and intimate partner violence, and only in very few cases were guns involved. What I can tell you is that the current legislation is very effective, but it just needs to be properly enforced. That's the problem. We need to make people aware, those who are that they can flag these individuals. there's been an attempt to insert that into Bill C21, but I've been using the principle of flagging for years. I've preventatively seized a number of firearms over the years, so I'm not minimising how worthwhile it will be, but C21 will only have an impact of about 2 or 3% of weapons, legal weapons, which are involved in crimes. And that is the crux of the issue. We need to determine what is killing people in our streets, innocent victims. But that doesn't take away from what you just said, Senator. We just need to look closely at the situation, analyse it. There have been a lot of femicides in Quebec recently. From memory, well, I think there was one single case where firearms were used. I recall a case where an individual was part of a hunting association. The Sûreté du Québec seized his firearms, and then the person went on to kill with a knife. You know, if someone wants to do what they want to do, unfortunately, oftentimes very little can stop them from committing those acts, and I've experienced that myself. Well, you're basing what you say on your experience, but there are also statistics that demonstrate that when there is a legal or illegal firearm used, there's a much higher likelihood that these women will be killed or injured. Yes, you're right, Senator. Would you like to add to that, sir? Well, that's exactly what I was about to say. One can't deny the state of affairs that you're describing. There is no zero risk in this world. And an individual who's in crisis or depressed, things aren't going well, his wife just left him, for example, if he doesn't have access to a legal or illegal firearm, he's going to use another tool to meet those ends. Well, that's not a good enough reason to try and reduce the number of weapons in circulation. No, you're right, but we just need to be aware of this, cognizant of this. But you seem to be saying that the only issue currently is illegal firearms.
We've certainly run out of time, I'm afraid.
I'm
so
sorry.
As important
I'm
as
sorry,
this
I
issue
get,
is, we now go to Senator Cardoza.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm a bit disconcerted by some of the comments because I think you're, or maybe I don't understand the issue here, but it would seem that you're suggesting, Mr. Wall and Mr. Lennard, that most of the problem comes out of Montreal North with people who listen to gangster rap. And I'm sensing that there's a much larger problem in the country with guns, as my colleague just talked about, Senatrice Méville-Deschênes, that there is a considerable problem about for women who are subject to violence in domestic situations, in urban as well as rural areas. We heard from various groups earlier on, from women's groups who were concerned that in rural areas there is violence as much as there is in urban areas, and there is much less support for women to be able to get away from a violent home and so forth. I think about the extreme right. I think about incels. I'm wondering if you have any concerns about domestic violence, incels, extreme right. And maybe if I can just ask you to comment on that, Mr. Weber, just on, in terms of CBSA, if you can just tell us what exists presently that CBSA officers can keep guns out of Canada? Like, what can you do presently? And is the gap primarily in between legal entry points, or are your staff not able to, don't have the time to examine every car? I mean, I've come through the board and had to wait a long time, so is it that they're pressed for time? And maybe you can comment for that, and then I'll ask the other two gentlemen to comment as well.
Sure, thank you. The problems are everywhere. Given our staffing levels, the difficulty in interdicting anything exists at land borders, air, rail, marine. Legislatively, we don't have the ability to interdict between ports of entry whatsoever.
Between means sort of in the miles between one port of entry and another.
Exactly, yes. That's the purview of the RCMP to do that. When people run the port and drive through, we have no ability to chase them down. We have to call the police agency to help, who do if they're available to do so, which is often too late. We have certain modes, such as I mentioned, rail, that we don't really inspect at all. And at our ports of entry, we're so short-staffed, it's become almost primarily about facilitation. We don't have the people available to actually do those secondary searches and inspections that we should be doing to keep the firearms out.
Avec respect, monsieur.
With all due respect, Senator Cardozo, first, well, I was referring to the gangster rap culture in response to your colleague's question. And indeed, it's only part of the issue. But when young people are influenced in this way, why are they attracted by violence? That's a question one has to ask oneself. That's a key part of the issue. There are, of course, other factors that come into play. Now, what we need to understand here is that this is a very broad problem and issue. C21 will provide police officers with a number of tools. We're not denying that fact, but the fact remains that overall, the statutory instruments that we've seen in the last couple of years haven't led to the desired results, haven't reduced the crime rates across Canada. I gave a couple of examples, and I believe that C21 will not reduce violent crime significantly across Canada because it's not targeting the right target. Are we in favour of motherhood and apple pie? Yes. Will this work, concretely speaking? It will not, as other legislative measures have failed to.
I'm afraid we have to move on. We next go to Senator Deacon representing Ontario.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. It's really, really important testimony. I just want to come back to maybe clarifying two things first. Mr. Weber, just the first thing I want to ask you about is a comment about continued shortage of staff, cutbacks, whatever it is. Is it because the budget is trimmed and you're being asked to do more with less? Or is it because, like there's a program, we all know, college program for border services. Is it because you can't get enough graduates into the jobs? Where's the problem?
So it's both. The budget is what it is. The college itself, we currently only have one college that could graduate about a maximum of 600 officers per year, which doesn't cover attrition. We desperately need a second college to begin there to get our numbers back up to the 2,000 or 3,000 additional that we need to patrol properly.
So is it 2 colleges, 2 programs, 1,200? Or
No.
Need more?
I mean, right now we have one. We would be thrilled to get a second.
Yeah, okay.
A third would be gravy.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. And the other question, and a follow-up too, is for border services control. We've talked and listened to professional, competitive Olympic shooters. And to know them is to know the challenges they have in transporting their sports equipment. So my question is from a border perspective, do you have any idea about the hoops that these athletes are trying to jump through to transport their weapons internationally?
So the paperwork, and I know the CBSA website itself is quite comprehensive in exactly what you need to transport that. As far as I know, there haven't been any major issues with that.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for that. And the other thing, I'll keep going until I get cut off. I wondered also, when we look at these weapons that are traveling across the border, you talked about the number 90%. Is, in your experience, do we know which border points these weapons are primarily coming from? And is it more or less, ubiquitous across our boards and borders, or are there specific places where the majority of illicit guns are being captured as they cross, or perhaps being neglected because of staffing? I'm not sure.
It's a little bit of everywhere. I mean, it's amazing what you cannot find when you don't look. We're not doing the inspections that we could because we simply don't have the staff to do it, right? So it's very difficult to say where they're coming in. We're not really looking. That's the difficulty.
Okay, so if I'm not a gangster, I mean to say, if I'm a gun exporter to Canada and you tell me that 1% of the inspections, we're only doing 1% of offshore on shipping, wouldn't I be taking thousands and thousands and thousands of illegal weapons and trying to ship them not through our truck borders, but through our waterways?
I think you could go that route, yes. I think rail would be another good route
Rail?
you could go.
Yeah.
There's a few. We don't even inspect rail at the first point of entry into Canada. We inspect at first point of inspection, which means that rail cars are traveling sometimes 400 kilometers into Canada before they could ever even be looked at, and most of the time they're still not even looked at.
Okay, thank you. Now,
Much. We have 4 senators on the list: Senator Carignan, Richards, Youssef, and Dasco. Senator Carignan, over to you.
It must be frustrating as a police officers. You're retired, Mr. Wall, Mr. Gelina. Now, police officers on duty nowadays must be very demoralized and frustrated. How do our police officers feel at this current juncture? I understand what you're saying. It's not that Bill C21 won't have any effect, but the effect will be mitigated. You know, to hammer in a nail, I need a hammer, not a screwdriver. Now, if I use a screwdriver to hit the nail, maybe it'll go in a little bit, but that's not the tool I need. I need a hammer. I need a hammer to hit the nail in to the wood. Now, the federal government has made announcements with great pomp and ceremony, legislation that will address all of the issues, a lot to do with arms trafficking in Montreal North, even though that has very little to do with the problem at hand. How do police officers feel? You're right. We feel at a loss, and it started with Bill C5. We understood that there was a dichotomy with the seriousness of the problem and the solution that was being proposed. It was kind of like trying to wave a magic wand to make the problem disappear, and it's not the right tool. And this is the same issue with Bill C21. I've spoken at length with the experts from the specialised units that I worked with. We could... If we got rid of all guns, no more hunters, no more sports shooters, well, there won't be fewer violent crimes in our newspapers because, as I said earlier, most of these law-abiding gun owners are not using these guns to commit these kinds of offences. It's the illegal guns that are being smuggled in via the US border and through Indigenous reserves. They're the guns that are being used, and you're right, we're frustrated that we're not being listened to. If I could just chime in, Bill C-70 85. In 2022 in Montreal, police officers, when they intercepted a vehicle, discovered a gun in the back of the vehicle. 3 young people were arrested on possession of a firearm, and when the patrollers contacted the investigatory unit, well, they said, we don't know if it's a real weapon, but since they are juveniles, let's send them back to their parents, and therefore they were released. And so when my colleague earlier spoke about finding a way of controlling firearms use among youth, well, it doesn't set the right example. These were teenagers that had weapons. They're not experts at using those weapons, but they're released thanks to Bill C-75. You can imagine how discouraged the police officers were in the face of that, the trivialization of violence that we see among our youth. They're able to walk away.
We we're out of time,
brief?
I'm afraid. No, I'm afraid not. Senator Richards, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here, really. How much ability do you have, or how much influence can Canada exert on those certain reserves that have their own policing and straddle both sides of the border, and who believe in many respects that they are their own nation? How much influence can we have to mitigate the smuggling of arms, or do we have any?
Merci pour votre question, Monsieur le Sénateur.
Thank you for your question, Senator. Well, it is indeed very tough. The work of Indigenous police officers is a highly complicated one. Policing one's brothers-in-law, members of one's family, ain't easy. We're talking about small territories, and it's not an easy job. And obviously, there's an issue of reliability there. There's so many people that know each other intimately, and we just don't see this in other contexts. Now, yes, let me just remind you of something that occurred a couple of weeks ago. There were two individuals that are accused of smuggling tobacco, and they were acquitted for reasons I won't go into. The judges decided that. But even the Defence Council said that the Montreal Police and RCMP didn't enter Indigenous reserves, and when they did so, if it had to do with Indigenous individuals, they had to ask for permission, and any action they took had to be in line with local rules. There were immigrants that died last summer. The human trafficker was, at the hands of a human trafficker. Now, if I'm a member of a criminal gang, I can more or less circulate anywhere. But if I knew that I can get through more easily in an Indigenous territory, of course I'm going to do so. If I could just add on to that response, I mentioned this in my opening remarks, we need to better fund the information intelligence on reserves. Most people on Indigenous reserves are law-abiding people who don't agree with what unscrupulous lawbreakers are doing. So we need to better inform police officers, Indigenous police officers, but also the neighbouring teams. There need to be more mixed joint teams between Indigenous police, the Sûreté du Québec, the OPP. And if you're trying to avoid a diplomatic crisis, of course, since the Oka crisis, things have become more sensitive. But the fact remains that there needs to be greater collaboration. There need to be more searches of vehicles, for example, by land, by sea, by road, because that's how the weapons are getting through these Indigenous reserves. So there's a whole raft of measures that will help to make our Indigenous territories more watertight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Richards. Senator Youssef is next, followed by Senator Dasco, and we might have a bit of time beyond that for Senator Carignan to ask his supplementary question. So, Senator Youssef.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witness for being here. I guess my first question is both to Mr. Gilness and Mr. Wall. I hear your perspective, but a number of police chiefs have also been here today testifying in regard to the bill, and there are many aspects of this bill which they find would be very useful in doing their job. It's not a perfect bill. Legislation are never, I guess, never give us the utopian solutions we're looking for. But why are you so definitive? You don't think there's any aspects of this bill is not helpful in a variety of ways? On ghost guns, the bill provide new provisions to track and the technology and the development, which, given the proliferation of this technology, you don't even need to smuggle a gun anymore. You can manufacture them right here because people can do it illegally. And there are many other aspects in regard to interdiction that are critical, collaboration with our American friends in the counterintelligence unit and support. So isn't there an aspect from this bill that you're missing and seeing that they will be very helpful for police officers on the front line in helping them better do their jobs?
Monsieur le Sénateur,
Senator, obviously everything that has to do with ghost guns, and Assistant Chief Wilson mentioned this earlier, obviously things need to be done to prevent the proliferation of knowledge and computer files that can be used to manufacture ghost guns. You know, if there's an ability to do what you're saying, well, then indeed it's a serious issue. Now, you spoke about the Americans. The problem is in the US, it's a constitutional right to have a firearm. Here in Canada, fortunately, it's a privilege only. And we know in Canada just how tough it is to amend a constitution. I don't need to give you a history lesson about that. But in the US, well, those individuals who sell their firearms, if they end up in Canada, well, they don't care what the origin of the firearm is. They don't see it as a crime. And there's a lot of agencies in the United States that are involved when a package is shipped from Florida, for example, where there's the highest number of illegal firearms. But it takes so many resources, not just in Canada, but in the US, to track those packages. And at the end of the day, it's very tough to put together a case against these offenders. Listen, they don't lose any sleep over the fact that there are guns getting through the borders. Now, C21, as you said, does have certain good aspects to it. It kind of codifies what we were already doing as police with the whole red flag approach. That already existed, but it puts it in black and white, it codifies it, it makes it official. We can't be against motherhood and apple pie. Now, to have an offence to change a magazine, to turn it into a high-capacity magazine, that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. But what's going to happen is specialists and experts are going to tell these offenders exactly how to circumvent those rules. And so it's not black and white here. There are good things in this legislation, but unfortunately, overall, it won't address the issue because over 90% of the guns are illegal. That's the problem.
Did I use up my time there, Chair?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm
All
afraid
right.
so.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Gélinas and Mr. Wall, you've obviously emphasized the presence of illegal guns in Canada being a source of crime, but I wonder what you have to say about the fact that we have had so many mass shootings in Canada, Polytechnique, Dawson, Moncton, the Quebec Mosque, Fredericton, all involving legal firearms. These were all legal firearms. And there have been mass domestic murders also involving legal guns, like the one that just happened in Sault Ste. Marie, where an ex-spouse and 3 children were shot dead, plus another victim injured, and the killer killed himself. So, do you consider these to be crimes?
Évidemment.
Obviously, I do.
Statistics? Are they in your statistics?
Ils font partie des
Yes, they are part of our statistics. And I agree with you that the crimes that you described, i.e. mass shootings, well, we can't compare ourselves to our neighbours to the south. There are hundreds, thousands of mass shootings there. But if we look at a 150-year history in Canada, fortunately, there haven't been that many. There have been few and far between. I agree with you that one is too many. Zero risk doesn't exist. Driving is a privilege, and over the past 3 years in Quebec, there have been over 1,000 casualties on the roads. So we have to look at this proportionately. If you look at the total number of murders that have been committed using guns or by other means, and the unfortunate events that you've described, proportionately speaking, it's quite a low percentage. But that doesn't take away from what you're saying. There must be ways of doing things more effectively. Porte-à-Pique was the biggest mass killing in Canada, and that was using illegal guns. It was an RF-15 that got through a leaky border. Now, C21 won't have any bearing on that. Criminals don't care about the law. And it's our experience and the experience of our colleagues that we've described. The problem is that this isn't hypothetical at the border. The border is very porous. Number one, it's a very long border. And number two, well, it's porous. There's a lack of resources. But also look at the existing legislation. There are criminal record checks that should be more comprehensive, that should be more serious. Permits, licenses are issued for a duration of 5 years. Now, if there's no incident reported before the renewal of a license, unfortunately there are no ad hoc checks that are conducted. Perhaps there need to be ad hoc spot checks that are made. That might be a good idea. But from our experience, and I've dealt with thousands of cases of conjugal and domestic violence, I can tell you this: when an individual is determined to kill his spouse or children, well, they're going to find a way of doing it, and guns are not the main weapon used to commit these heinous crimes. These are not family dramas, these are murders.
Well, we have so many instances of legal guns being used in crime. I mean, surely you're not saying this isn't a problem.
Right. Écoutez, vous dites...
No. Well, you're saying that there's so many, but Statistics Canada in 2021 said that only 2.6% of all violent crimes involved a firearm. And in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, it was 3%. So 97% of violent crimes don't involve firearms.
Thanks very much. I'm afraid we have to move on. We've got a few minutes left. I've got Senator Platt and Senator Dagenet and Senator Platt on for a second round. There are a couple of minutes each. Time for a quick question, a quick answer.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Mr. Weber. Now, you spoke about the border crossings. Every time that I have an opportunity to ask questions of the CBSA senior officials, they said that everything's going fine and dandy. They're putting in place measures, and yet your remarks speak to the very opposite. When it comes to combating guns and gun smuggling, what should be done? Politicians say they're investing massive amounts of money to address this issue. Do you know where the money's going? What should be done?
The money invested is certainly not going towards staffing. I could provide examples. I mean, we have our busiest land border in Windsor hasn't had a functioning X-ray since pre-COVID. We have marine units with no boat. We call them the dock crew. The situation is absolutely dire, and the difficulty that I have with the counterparts I sit across at the CBSA, which is very different from other policing agencies, is for the most part they're people who've never done the job. So I'm explaining it to new people year after year after year. I've been doing this union work for over a decade, and it is a new cast of characters that repeats itself every year and a half, every 2 years, and they don't come from the line and they don't take our input on how to actually secure our borders. The other big problem we have, again, that I've highlighted a couple times, we have no ability to do any work between our ports of entry. It's almost 9,000 kilometers of border, and those are just blind spots for us.
Merci, Monsieur Weber. Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Thank you, Mr. Weber.
Well, thank you, and thank you for answering my second question, Mr. Weber. That was going to be my second question if I got time, but I do have a different one. On October 23rd, we heard from Aaron McCrory, Vice President of Intelligence and Enforcement Branch of CBSA. And he said that about 400 of 1,100 firearms seized at the border in 2022 were seized at ports of entry, in other words, where CBSA had primary responsibility. However, only a very small portion of those firearms were being smuggled by criminal organizations and were therefore destined specifically for illegal use. Most guns being seized by CBSA were simply being taken from American travelers who may not have been familiar with the Canadian law, thinking they legally could bring their gun across in their truck. And is that consistent with your experience? And is it fair to say that most illegal gun smuggling into Canada by criminal groups does not occur through ports of entry?
So those statistics, I believe, are correct, and it is a very common phenomenon that Americans simply do not know what our laws are and don't know that they're not allowed to bring those handguns into Canada. To say that the majority are not coming through our ports of entry, again, we're looking at very little, so it's very difficult to provide accurate statistics when you're not looking for what you're trying to find. Again, I highlighted the deficiencies in rail, in marine, our inability to patrol between ports of entry. Obviously, those are big gaps for us. But at our land borders, you know, again, we're doing very few searches because our staffing levels are so low. It's all become about facilitation, and the money we see being invested is being invested into technologies that take away interaction with travelers. It's about pre-clearance. It's about artificial intelligence. It's about ways for people to clear without ever having to interact with an officer or have anything searched, which is very concerning. We're here talking about keeping illegal firearms out of Canada. No one's ever going to declare that I'm smuggling in a firearm. That's simply never going to happen.
So it would be fair to assume, gentlemen, that in your opinion, C21 is not the answer to our problems. Please.
I think there are some real positives in C21. We've provided some proposals to things we don't know if we could be added as part of C21, but in order to keep those illegal firearms out of Canada, we need to be doing more at our borders.
We would be interested in hearing your proposals, and we'd be happy to have you send them to us through the clerk.
Pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Senator Boisvenu, did you have a quick question?
Microphone, please. Yes, I was in the other chamber defending my bill, which is moving along swimmingly, so I apologise for arriving late. Now, my question is this. You've said that the majority, almost all the killings that have occurred in Canada over the past 20 years have been committed with illegal guns. Well, almost all of the mass killings in Canada have been committed by those who had legal firearms. Porte-à-pique was not the case with Porte-à-pique, but yes, unfortunately, that is often the case. We know that since 1999, there's been a drop in femicides using guns. There's been 6 pieces of legislation that were enacted over that time frame that have had no effect. In fact, there's been the change has been about 2%. Regardless of the legislation that's been enacted. And one of the pieces of legislation cost $2 or $3 billion, and that had very, very little bearing on crime rates. So perhaps this bill will cost $1 billion for the firearms buyback. Will that $1 billion, will we get bang for our buck and reduce crime rates? Absolutely not. You've referred to the order and the buyback program, if I'm correct, Mr. Senator. You're right. Assault firearms the government had decided to leave those with those individuals, but following pressure from lobby groups that are wanting to abolish firearms, they applied pressure and the government did change its mind. But it's been 3 years. Hasn't AR-15 been used in a mass killing in Canada? Absolutely not. Only in Porte-à-pique. It was an illegal weapon that came from Maine. So once again, the amnesty has been extended for another 2 years. Now, if I may, I'm not wanting to be cynical. We're being told that there'll be an apocalypse, and there's been a conflation of what's occurring in the US and with Canada. We haven't seen that apocalypse occur at the end of the day.
Over time, Senator Boisvenu, I apologise. Colleagues, this brings us to the end of this panel, and I want to extend sincere thanks to Mr. Weber, Mr. Wall, and Mr. Lennard. You've taken us over time, which always means that you've done your job well. We greatly appreciate your experience, your expertise, and your advice that you bring us today. And I'd like to thank members around the table, my colleagues, for their participation this evening. As always, they brought out the very best of our witnesses. We'll continue our examination of this bill on Wednesday, November the 22nd at 11:30 a.m. in room B45. And colleagues, we're approaching the end of our list of witnesses and anticipate proceeding to clause-by-clause consideration next week on Monday, November 27th. I remind members who wish to propose amendments that they're encouraged to consult the Office of the Senate Law Clerk to ensure that any amendments are drafted in the proper format and in both official languages. And with that, I wish you all a good evening and thank you. The meeting is now adjourned.